So I was reading this story last night, and it managed to make me do that thing where I turn around to make sure I'm still alone in the room. It creeped me out pretty good at a couple parts. I've not heard a creature description quite as vivid and disturbing as this in a long time. Of all the allegedly true stories I've heard, I hope this one is fake the most. It's called, "I Spent a Winter Crab Fishing in the Bering Sea. Something out there was fishing too." From an anonymous sender. Just be careful if you're listening to this. You're gonna want the lights on for this one. This is Unexplained Encounters. I'm Darkness Prevails. Now, let's begin. This was the winter of 2006, going into 2007. I was 19. I grew up in Anacortes, up in the islands in Washington, a fishing town that's slowly turning into a town for people who like to look at fishing. My dad ran a gill netter before his back went, then ran a forklift at the cannery. We weren't poor, per se, but nobody ever said the word college to me, like it was a thing that was even going to happen. I had graduated high school by the skin of my teeth, and I spent a year straight doing nothing. I owed a guy money at the time. I'd also wrecked a truck. I needed to get out. I needed to get some real money, more than what I could make in town. And everybody in a town like that knows there's exactly only one place a dumb, strong 19-year-old goes to get it in a hurry. You go north. You go crab fishing. My Uncle Pete had done a few seasons in the 90s and still knew people. He made a call he probably shouldn't have made, to be honest, and that's how I ended up in a bar in Dutch Harbor in the middle of October, sitting across from a man named Halfthor. Everybody called him Cap. He eyed me up and down like I was some tool he could buy from a yard sale. At the time, I think he was about 60, and he had a face that looked like a worn-out boot. "Pete says you're not afraid of work," he said. "I'm not," I answered, not sure if I was even telling the truth. "Everybody says that. You ever been seasick?" He leaned forward. I felt a little nervous. "I've been out plenty of times on my dad's boat." "Ah," he scoffed. "That's the sound. That's a bathtub. This isn't that. You'll be a greenhorn. Half share for you. You'll do every miserable job on the boat and get yelled at. And if you make it the whole season, you'll make more than your daddy made all year. But if you quit halfway, you'll fly home on your own dime. Sound fair?" I was honestly amazed that I was being offered the job right there, that fast. It did not particularly sound fair, but I agreed with him and accepted his offer. His boat was the St. Jude. I didn't know back then that St. Jude is the patron saint of lost causes. I had to look that up years later, and when I did, it sort of made sense. She was a steel crabber, a little under 110 feet long, red and white except for the spots of rust, and it was mostly rust. Cap owned her outright, which was rare, and it meant the whole operation was his neck. There were 5 of us aboard besides him, and I'll tell you about them, because they matter to this story, and some of them aren't around anymore to tell you themselves. The deck boss was Wade Tucker. Everybody called him Tuck. He was in his mid-30s and built like a fire hydrant, missing the top of one of his fingers. He taught me everything I know about not getting killed, which is its own dark joke I'll come back to. He was hard on me, but only because he wanted to keep me alive. He'd cuff me on the back of the head, call me an idiot, then sit up until 2 in the morning explaining how a coil of line behaves. I know he doesn't sound it, but he was very patient, like a school teacher, and it was mainly when he taught me things, like with that line. There was Sully, too, Aaron Sullivan, mid-20s, quiet and a good worker. As I recall, he was from somewhere in Oregon. Sully had lost a younger brother to the water when they were children. drowned in a river. I only know that because of what happened later. But he never talked about it. He never talked about much. There was also a guy named Pogo. Pogo something. I think he was Portuguese, out of California. This guy never stopped moving or bouncing or talking, and he was cracking jokes that were mostly terrible. He was the youngest after me, 23, with a laugh you could hear over the hydraulics, which is quite the feat. He's the reason I can't watch those fishing shows they put on TV. Every one of those crews has a pogo, and it reminds me of these days. There was Gil, too, the engineer, in his 60s and deaf in one ear. He had been fishing the Bering Sea since before I was a thought. Gil is the one who told me most of what I'm about to tell you, down in the engine room over instant coffee. And at the time I thought he was a crazy old man just playing me for a joke. So basically we're on the same page here, thinking all of this is nothing, just made up nonsense. But you'll see, just as I would soon see. Anyway, I'd grown up around boats, so I thought I understood things. But I understood nothing. The Bering Sea in winter is the most dangerous water there is to work on, and it's not even close. The water sits right around 38 degrees. Go in without a survival suit, and you have, depending on who you ask, a few minutes before your body stops doing anything it wants to do. Your hands quit first, then everything after that. And it's not even the water that gets most guys. It's the gear. The pots are steel cages, 7 feet on a side, and a king crab pot weighs around 700 pounds dry, and a lot more wet and full, and it's always getting thrown around. You stack them, bait them, launch them off the side on a line behind a buoy. They sit on the bottom. You come back, hook the buoy, run the line through a hydraulic block, haul the pot up, empty it, and do it again. Hundreds of times, 4 days in a row. You don't get to sleep. During a real opener, you might be on deck 30 hours straight, and you gotta do it because every pot is money. The season is short, there's no overtime. There is no second chance. There's nobody coming to make you stop. Tuck drilled the line into me before he'd let me near the launcher. We were tied up at the dock before we even went out, and he had a length of it coiled at our feet. "The line is the thing that kills you," he said. "Not so much the cold or the falling in, but the line. A pot goes over the side, and that line's going with it, and it's going fast. If any part of you is in it, your foot, your ankle, a loop around your boot, it'll take you over the rail and down to the bottom before anybody can do a single thing. You understand me, kid?" Yeah. Definitely, I understand. That scared me a bit, imagining myself drowning at the bottom of the sea. "Ah, no, you don't understand. Why do I even ask? Nobody understands. Not until they see it." He kicked the coil. Your job when we're setting is to know where your feet are every single second. Where are your feet?" I looked down. "No, not now, always. That's the job. Where are your feet?" He said it like a mantra. I came to learn that's exactly what it was. Where are your feet? Something you need to know at all times without having to look down. Here's the other thing I have to set up. This is where you'll start deciding about me, so brace up. There were rules on the St. Jude that didn't seem to have anything to do with safety. Cap had them, and Tuck enforced them, but nobody bothered to explain them to the greenhorn at the start. We didn't fish a certain piece of ground after dark. There was a spot Cap and Tuck called the slot. On the plotter, it was just a deep finger of water, a trench, dropping off where the rest of the grounds were shallow. The crab were real thick there, too. Thicker than anywhere. I asked Pogo our first week why we always pulled off the slot and ran shallow before nightfall when the fat pots were out deep. Pogo, who'd usually explain anything, just bounced on his feet and said, "Cap's thing. He's got a thing about it. You'll get used to it." And he went back to work. That was the first time I saw a cheerful man on that boat, not one to keep talking about something. The second rule: nobody went out on the deck alone after dark. Ever. If you had to go out, you woke up someone else. Even to take a leak over the rail at night, you brought a buddy. I figured that was a hazing thing that they did to the new guy. Remember, I was given no reasoning behind these rules. The third rule, and Cap said this one to my face the first night: if you ever hear singing out here, you don't go looking for it. But what you do need to do is wake me up, and I don't care what hour it is. I couldn't help but laugh at that. It was a funny thing to say, and I was only 19. I thought it was a joke. But Cap looked at me with that boot face and didn't laugh, and his face was stone cold. I stopped immediately and felt really stupid. The first opener went about the way they expected, which is to say it nearly killed me, and I loved and hated it about equally. King crab. We pounded out to the grounds in weather I thought was a storm, but all the other guys treated it as a Tuesday, and we sat our string. I learned that cold and wet and exhausted was a state you can live in for a very long time. I threw up once from the bait. They chop herring and cod heads, and the bait freezer is its own circle of hell, and Tuck never let me forget it. I learned to coil line clean and keep my feet. We hauled and baited and launched for what the log said was 31 hours straight, and what felt like one gray unending hour with no front and no back to it. Somewhere deep in the second night, working the deck under the sodium lights with the black water heaving past the rail, I heard it the first time. I'll be careful here, because this is where it's easiest to lie in these kinds of stories, even to yourself. It's easy to fill things in with what you decided it was later, so I'll share it with you objectively. What I noticed was that I'd started feeling good. Too good. And at first I had no way to explain it. I'd been running on no sleep and adrenaline. But suddenly, very, very suddenly, I felt warm and calm. There was a sound underneath the engine and the wind, a low sound, and I thought it was the engine doing something new, maybe hitting a certain rhythm of water. But then I thought it was in my own head, a ringing kind of sound, like that temporary tinnitus you sometimes get. It rose and fell, though, and if you held still and let it, it moved through the deck plates and up through your boots and into your chest. So strange, so joyful. I straightened up from the pot I was working on and looked out past the lights into the dark. I had the strongest feeling that there was someone out there, but not a boat. A person very close, looking back at me. But I didn't feel scared. I should have been in that situation, but I was not scared. Rather, I felt I should go to the rail and look even closer. That's when Tuck's hand came down on the back of my neck, hard, and he physically forced me to turn around. "Eyes on your work," he said. Only seriousness in that face, which was 4 inches from mine. "You hear something, you keep your eyes on your work and you tell me. Did you hear something?" "I don't know. Thought I heard the engine acting weird," I told him. He looked at me a second longer than the reply needed. "That's not the engine," he said. But that was it. He then went back to the block. For the rest of that haul, Tuck kept himself between me and the rail, but he did it sort of subtly, not making a deal about it. We came off the slot and ran shallow before the sun was even down. By the time we'd offloaded, I'd slept 14 hours and eaten everything in Dutch Harbor, but by then, the whole thing had shrunk in my memory into nothing. Tired guy hears weird noise. That's all it was. I didn't need to think about it more. But Gil would not let it stay nothing. We were tied up a couple days between openers, and Cap had me learning every job on the boat. That week it was Gil's job. We were drinking the worst coffee I've ever tasted. And out of nowhere, not looking at me, Gil said, "You know, I heard her out there. The first night, Tuck had to grab you." I wasn't sure what to say. "Oh, you don't have to say anything. I've seen that look on about 40 greenhorns by now. I had it myself 40 years ago." He set down the rag and cleared his old throat. "You want to know what it is? Or you want to be one of those guys who decides he didn't hear a thing?" Now, I should have been one of those guys, but instead I asked, "Okay, Gil, what is it?" He explained, seriously. I had been expecting his expression or tone to be like telling a ghost story, but it was nothing like that. "All right, there's a thing out there. On the grounds, mostly out deep, the slot and a couple other trenches. Been here longer than any of us. Longer than the fishery, I'd bet. The old hands call it different things. Some of the boys called her the lady, on account of the singing, like the singing rocks that wreck the ships." He almost smiled. "Except it's not a lady, and no ship gets wrecked. So the name never made sense to me. I just call it the Devourer, because that's what it does. That's the only part anybody really knows for sure. Near as anyone's put it together, and I've listened my whole life, mind you, so I've got more than most. Firstly, it sings, and the singing does something to your head. It makes you feel real good, and it makes you not so afraid, and that makes you want to come even closer, to the rail, to the water. Now, some men it gets its hooks in deep. Secondly, it puts pictures in your head. People you've lost. It'll show you somebody dead, but like they're right there, under the surface, reaching up for you. And you'd swear on your mother it was real, and go in after them. Men have done it right in front of me. I've seen it. Going over the side, going in after someone 20 years in the ground." "Could be hallucinations," I said, "from the thing that's singing." "Well, call it that if it helps you. Going on, thirdly, and this is the only part that lets me get some sleep out here, it has never once, that anybody can tell me, taken a man that was breathing. It doesn't itself pull you in, doesn't reach out and grab you. It can't do that, or maybe it won't, I don't really know. The ones it draws to the rail go on their own, and mostly somebody grabs them in time and they're just fine. The ones that go in didn't drown because of it. They drowned because they went into 38-degree water in the dark, and that's the sea that kills you. 3 minutes flat, no help needed." He relaxed and sat back. "It waits for the water to do the work. Then it comes and takes what's left." "Gil, that's insane. So you're telling me there's a sea monster out here, and it only eats dead guys after luring them into the water. I was pretty blunt about it, but Gil didn't get mad, and that stuck with me for years. The way he looked at me, I could tell he thought I was just naive. He pitied me. "Son," he said, "you ever wonder why the Coast Guard recovers so few of the people that go overboard? A boat goes down 6 aboard and they only find 1. Then they find no one else year after year. Where do you think they all go? Big ocean, sure. The current, the cold, yeah, that's what everyone says." He picked the rag back up. "I've pulled gear off the bottom out here for 40 years, and I'm telling you, a man in a survival suit floats. They're made to float. That's the whole point. So you tell me why we find the empty suits sometimes, and not the person who was inside." I didn't have anything to say to that. Really, I was getting the heebie-jeebies. The rules ain't superstition, boy," Gil said. "Cap's lost men to it. Before your time. He don't talk about it, and you won't ask him. The rules work, that's all. You don't go out alone at night, because alone is when it gets you. You don't fish the slot after dark, because deep and dark is where it's strongest, where it gets in your head, and the next thing you know, a man is at the rail. If you hear it, you go wake Cap, because he knows how to get the boat loud and lit up, and it don't like that. The engine, all the lights, it backs off from that." He shrugged. "That's everything I know. A lifetime out here, and that's everything I know. Keep the rules, and you go home alive. We all do." I went up out of the engine room that day about 90% sure Gil was a lonely old man who had concocted a story to explain a sad fact about a dangerous job. The bodies thing had 100 ordinary explanations. The singing was wind and an exhausted brain. I held on to that 90% for as long as I could. The Opilio season is what broke it. King crab wraps up. Then in January and February you go out for Opilio, snow crab, which is the deep cold, the ice and the dark and those short days. The worst of it. Most of what I'm about to tell you happened then. By then I wasn't much of a greenhorn anymore. Not really. I'd put on muscle, losing my softer parts, and I'd stopped getting yelled at except when I deserved it. I'd really started to love it, in a Stockholm Syndrome sort of way. I felt invincible, though. Maybe it was because I was 19, finally having money in my bank, having calluses on my hands. The hum came back the first night we worked deep, and it was stronger than I heard it before. Or maybe I was weaker, maybe I was more open to it. This time I knew what it was the second I felt it coming. The warmth and the calmness. The underneath sound of moving through the deck. So I did what I'd been taught. I went and told Tuck. I said to him, "I've got it again. The thing. I can hear it." He nodded calmly and said to me, "Good man. Stay close, stay loud, eyes down." And then he started talking. Just talking. Loud, about a truck he wanted to buy. And he had me talk back. I figured out the talking was a tool too. It's hard to drift off toward the water and die when you're arguing with a guy about a truck. But this time, I saw something. And that was the first real fear. The kind underneath the false calmness. I kept my eyes down like I was told, but you have to look up to work. And on one of those looks up, out past the lights, in the black water sliding by, I saw a face. Just for a second. A pale face down under the surface a few feet, like someone's face looks under a water in a pool, wavering, but turned up towards me. I want to say it was a woman, but the more I think about it, the less I'm sure it was anything you could put a sex or an age to. It was just a face, pale, in water no living face could be in. And it was calm. I could tell it wanted me to come closer. My body began to turn toward the rail on its own, and what saved me was Pogo. Pogo had chosen that second to slip out on the deck behind me and go down hard on his rear with a clatter and a string of Portuguese. The noise snapped me out of it. The face was gone. I was just standing there, with my heart going like a jackhammer. I immediately told Tuck what I saw. He didn't say I told you so. He got very still and serious and told me, "Okay, from here on you don't work the rail side at night. You work inboard. You let me and Sully take the rail. You stay on the launcher and the bait in the middle of the deck, you hear?" I nodded my head. Then he said, more quietly, "It's bad this year. Been getting worse the last few years. I don't know why." He looked at the dark. "Cap feels it too. He's pulling us off deep earlier and earlier." We pulled off the slot that night a full 2 hours before dark. It got worse. And it wasn't just me anymore, the greenhorn who could be written off as green. It was getting all of us, in different ways. Pogo stopped joking on the night hauls. I know that doesn't sound significant unless you knew Pogo. He joked through everything. That was the essence to his being. And yet, there came a point where on the deep hauls, he'd go quiet, gray-faced even. He would just do his work with his jaw clenched. Once I caught him with his hands over his ears for a second between pots, like a kid blocking out a fight in the next room. And he caught me seeing it, and he put his hands down real quick, never saying a word about it. Gil stayed below as much as Cap would let him. He said the steel and the engine noise was thicker down there, and he didn't hear that sound as bad. I started to understand that Gil being the engineer was no accident. He'd put himself down there on purpose decades ago. It was how he'd survived a whole life out here, burrowing into the loudest part of the boat. And Sully was the one it wanted. I understood that later. Sully with his drowned brother. Sully, who already had a dead person he'd give anything to see again. Gil had said it gets its hooks deepest in some men, and Sully was one of those men. One night, I was still asleep. We were running shallow, anchored up for a few hours of rest and some weather, dead middle of the night, and I woke up because Tuck was already up and moving about. Seeing Tuck moving about fast in the dark woke something in me before my brain even worked. I heard Cap's voice, low and hard, and that's the voice you don't argue with. He was saying a name. "Sully, Sully, look up at me. Sully." I came up the ladder and out onto the deck, and the cold hit me. The picture I saw there is burned into me forever. It was snowing. That fine, hard snow that goes sideways. The deck lights threw everything in orange. Sully was at the rail with one leg up over it, arms out, reaching down toward the water. and he was talking. His voice wasn't scared, and he did not sound crazy in the slightest. His voice was gentle and sure, and he sounded like he was talking to a little kid. "Hey," he was saying. "Hey, it's okay. I'm coming. I see you. Stay right there, I'm coming." Reaching down toward the black water with a look of pure relief on his face, like a man who'd carried something heavy his whole life, finally being told he could set it down. Cap and Tuck had him by the back of his float coat, both of them hauling him back, and Sully fought them hard to get to the water, a quiet and desperate strength, the whole time saying that gentle stuff to whatever he saw down there. I stood frozen until Cap roared at me, "Grab his damn legs! His legs!" I came unstuck and grabbed Sully around the knees, and the three of us dragged him back off the rail and down onto the deck. He thrashed, then all at once he went limp, and he started to sob. There was this grown man splayed out on a boat, completely broken, crying his eyes out in front of all of us. He kept saying his brother's name, Tommy. "That was Tommy. It was him in there. He was right there and you stopped me. He was right there. And I had him." Cap got the engine running, and every light on the boat was blazing. The whole thing was loud and as shaky as possible. We ran flat out toward nothing for a couple of hours, just so we could be moving. But nobody slept the rest of the night. Come morning, Sully was a different man, hollowed out. He wouldn't talk about it. Perhaps he couldn't, but I saw his hands trembling. When we hit Dutch Harbor, Cap took him aside on the dock. They were out there for a while, but then I watched as Sully got his gear and got off the boat. Cap settled with him in cash. I believe it was more than his share, and Sully shook all our hands without looking any of us in the eye, and he got in a cab. That was the last any of us saw of Aaron Sullivan. Sully lived, okay? If you were thinking I was telling a story about how he died in the water, that is not what happened. It drew him to the rail, and it nearly had him. It would have had him if Cap weren't a light sleeper. But Sully was able to go home alive. Years later, I went snooping about, and I found an Aaron Sullivan in Oregon, the right age, and an obituary from 2014. It didn't say how he died. He was only 33. I can't even be sure if it was the same Sully. I've decided to believe it wasn't. I get to decide some things, after all of this. We took on a new hand in Dutch to replace Sully, a guy named Warren I barely got to know. And we went back out. The season does not stop for you. There was quota in the water, and the St. Jude was Cap's whole life. We had to go. But on that next trip, someone died. It was daytime when it happened. Middle of the day. Nowhere near the dark. Nowhere near the slot either. We were on a shallow string, doing ordinary work. The singing, that humming, was not there. Nothing seemed wrong or out of place. Just the usual irritating weather and a sea that was up and a deck that wouldn't hold still. The typical conditions you work in all the time up there, so nobody was thinking twice about it. We were setting, not hauling, launching pots over the side. The way it goes, you've got the pot up on the launcher rack at the rail, baited, door tied, the coiled line and buoys staged, so they pay out clean. And on the call, you trip it and the pot slides off and the line zips out after it. It's the most single dangerous thing you do. Because of the line, which was everything Tuck told me the first day at the dock. Pogo was on the rail. I was on the bait, inboard, where Tuck had put me and kept me ever since the face. I was about 10 feet away, looking right at it. I've gone over what I saw 10,000 times. The boat took a big sea, a roll, a bad one, and the timing was the worst possible. The pot went off the rack too soon, with the boat rolling over hard, and the coiled line jumped. It came up off the deck in a loop, almost alive, and the loop dropped over Pogo's boot. I saw all of it happen, and I think Pogo felt it, because he immediately looked down, right at his feet. And then the line went tight. There was a 700-pound pot going over the side and down, and the line between it and Pogo's ankle had about a second of slack, and within a moment it didn't. Pogo flew off his feet so fast, it didn't even look like a person moving. It looked like the deck had been yanked out from under him. He hit the rail extremely hard and was dragged through the gap where the launcher was, his body folding around the steel horribly. There was one sound, then he was over and gone. The line was still screaming out after the pot, and the buoys went over last, bright orange and bobbing. They seemed perfectly normal, marking the spot where Pogo had gone. It's so crazy to think about. It all happened much, much faster than the time it took for you to read this. Tuck was already cutting it, throwing the brake and doing everything he could, and Cap was turning the boat. Warren, though, was screaming, and I don't actually remember what I did in those first few seconds. I'm told I was at the rail, but I don't remember getting there. I remember the buoys. I remember staring at them sitting on the gray water and understanding that Pogo was at the bottom of the line under them with a pot and 38-degree water. But knowing deep, deep down, his fate was already sealed. There was no chance that Pogo was gonna come back up. Not in a situation like that. Cap ran the whole man overboard process the way a professional would. We circled and through the ring, and we got our suits half on. The Coast Guard out of Kodiak was sending a helicopter towards us. But I think we all knew. It wasn't something any of us would or could say out loud at the time. Tuck got the line cut and we hauled that pot back up. But the line came up cut clean. Nothing on the end of it, just the cut line. The Coast Guard did their searching. They're unbelievably good, and they put a swimmer in that water, running the pattern for hours in failing light and in worsening weather, until they couldn't search anymore. They never found him. The line had been cut somewhere down there and given him back to the sea, and the sea decided to keep him. I told you it was daytime and that there was no hum or singing, right? That's true, and I say that because it means Pogo's death was an ordinary death, a fishing accident, the kind of thing that happens every year. Gil was right that the thing doesn't kill the living. The line was what killed Pogo, and that cold water with the bad timing of one rough wave. I've never been able to stop thinking about the part that came after, the fact they never found him, where the line came up cut clean with nothing on it. You see, a man goes down and is attached to a pot. The pot's on the bottom, the man's on the bottom with it. Recovery sometimes gets them back. But the line came up cut. Somewhere down in the dark, the line Pogo was on parted, and I've spent 18 years not letting myself wonder too hard about what cut it. We ran back into Dutch Harbor, with the flag down and the whole crew a wreck. Cap shut the boat down for a whole week, and I later understood that cost him a fortune mid-season. He never said a word about the money, though. They had a thing at the elbow room, something they do for lost fishermen, and a lot of crews came. You see, everybody's lost somebody out there. People said kind things about a kid most of them never met. Pogo's mom flew up from California, and I had to shake her hand, and I've never wanted so badly to be anywhere else. We went back out. We had a quota left to fulfill, and the St. Jude had to make her numbers or Cap was going to lose her. Warren quit, though. He'd had enough after that, but nobody blamed him. Cap could not find a replacement fast enough, though, so it would be the four of us for the last push. Cap, Tuck, Gil, and me. Short-handed, gutted, running on fumes and grief. Which brings me to the most terrifying night of my life. It was near the end of the season. We'd made our numbers, barely, and we were going to run in the next morning. That was going to be the season for us. We were anchored in the lee of an island, getting weather, a real blow coming through. Too rough to fish and nowhere to go, just riding it out on the hook. Cap, for the first time all season, let us drink. Oh, he knew we needed it. He understood the season had broken something in all of us, and a man can only hold so much. He brought up a bottle of whiskey. We sat in the galley, all the four of us, and drank to Pogo, and to Sully wherever he was at the time, and we prayed that the old boat stayed together. Gil told stories about guys from 30 years back, and for a couple of hours, it was almost fun. Basically the closest I'd felt to peace all season. I got drunk, and keep that in mind, and make decisions on what you believe here for yourself, for what I'm about to tell you. Sure, I was 19, and it wasn't legal, but I'd seen a man die, and I needed a drink. I drank more than the other guys, somehow, and around 2 a.m, the others turned in. Cap, Tuck, and Gil all went down to their racks, and I should have done that too. But I was too drunk and too sad, and I didn't want to be in my rack with my own thoughts yet. I figured, we're anchored, we're safe in the lee, I'll just go up a minute and get some air. I broke the rule. The first rule, the one Cap set with his own mouth my very first night. I went out on the deck alone, at night, with a bottle in my hand. And I didn't wake anybody. That superstitious danger was beginning to feel like a tall tale from an old man again. I should have known better. It had stopped snowing. The blow was up, but it was a clean kind of rough. Big swells, no snow, and there was no moon. Or the moon was buried, and it was dark. Dark like you do not get on land. Kinda felt like I was inside of an animal. Something big on the inside. The deck lights were off. We ran them off at anchor to save the batteries. There was just the one little anchor light up high, and the faint glow from the wheelhouse windows. So understand it was very, very dark. I did not see what I'm about to tell you in very good light. Hold on to that if you need to. I stood at the rail, the very same rail I'd not been allowed to stand at night for months. And I drank, looking out at the black water heaving up and down, back and forth, thinking about Pogo. And that grief came up, amplified by the alcohol. I started to cry, drunk, alone in the dark. I heard the hum. It seemed to be riding along the wind, a low sound moving through the deck and into my boots, and that warm feeling came with it, the false calmness. And in my state of drunk guttedness and loneliness, the most open a man can be, I didn't fight it even a little. Tuck was asleep, and I had no one to pull me out of it. So I leaned over the rail, and I looked down into the water, letting that feeling wash over me. The water below, right along the hull, started to pale. There was a paleness coming up from underneath, a sort of dim glow, like something light-colored rising slowly from far down, getting bigger as it came up. and I watched it, probably the same way Sully watched his little brother come up, little Tommy, with this awful relief, thinking I was about to be shown something I wanted. I think I was waiting to see Pogo's face. It wasn't Pogo's face. Not at first. At first, it was the size of it that hit me, because the pale thing kept getting bigger as it rose. It did not stop at the size of a mere man, and it didn't stop at the size of two. It kept coming up, getting wider and longer, and it broke the surface right against the hull with no splash, like pale oil coming up. This slow swelling up of something vast, and a smell came with it, like a big soggy pile of corpses, ages old. The smell of something from deep, deep down from the bottom of the sea, where nothing is supposed to live. That scent rolled up over the rail into my face, so thick and disgustingly wrong that false calmness broke, even if just for a second. And in that second of clarity, where my own animal body knew before my drunk brain did, I looked at what was actually below me. It was huge. It lay along the hull, just under the surface. It ran the better part of the length of the boat. It was pale, like dead pale, the white of something that has never seen the sun, like the underside of a deep-sea fish. The surface of it wasn't skin or scale, but something strange, something in between, wet and slick. And I swear it moved, but it wasn't like muscle pulsating, but like the surface of it was crawling, as if the whole thing was covered in a film that itself was alive too. I could not see any fins, and no shape that I could name, just that pale monstrosity lying against the boat. There was a part of it nearest me, up out of the water a little, that I understood after a second was the front of it. The head, if it had a head, and it was upturned towards me. In the front of it, there were faces. Not one face. Faces. There was a place where the pale wrongness had things in it that were malformed copies of human faces, pressed up under its surface, like the time I'd seen the single face under the water that first time, except now there were many, a crowd, overlapping faces, dim and wavering, all pale. I think they were the faces of the drowned, of the waterlogged damned. I think I was looking at everyone it had ever taken, held out in front of it, used and worn, shown one at a time to men leaning over rails. There were so many. Some looked old-fashioned somehow, like faces from a long time ago, and they were all turned up at me, calm and patient, with a terrible kindness, a look that said to me, "Come closer." And near the front of them, lower and newer, was a face I recognized. Pogo. It had his face. It was showing me my old shipmate's face, and that face was beckoning me calmly to come down to join it. Underneath it all, through the vast pale length of the thing, there was a slow motion, and that motion reminded me of one thing: digestion. It had something. It was working on devouring something, very slowly, and it had wanted to show me its food first. Was this how it was showing people all this time? Mocking its prey before taking them? I did not go in, and to this very day, I have no idea why I was spared, because every other man I knew that had encountered this thing and had been pulled by it, the influence had not been broken, without the help of an outside party. But to tell you the truth, I think it was the smell. The smell was so otherworldly and grotesque, it pushed me away, even as the thing called. Like touching the stove and pulling away in an instant because it's still hot. I came off that rail backward, falling on my rear on the deck. The bottle I'd been holding fell and broke. I scrambled back from the rail on my hands and feet like a desperate animal, and I soon realized I'd been screaming my lungs out for quite some time. At that moment, I was screaming for Cap. The boat came alive fast, lights and shouting. Cap was up in the wheelhouse faster than a 60-year-old man should move, and he had the engine roaring and the deck lights blazing in moments. Tuck came pounding out, finding me on my back near the gear, screaming, pointing at that rail, and Gil was right behind him. By the time the lights came on, the water along the hull was just water again, black and heaving. That awful smell was already fading away too. There was nothing there now. That thing made sure it was not going to be seen by anyone else. Just the drunk greenhorn on the deck, where he wasn't supposed to see, screaming about the faces he saw. It's funny though. Cap did not yell at me, and he wasn't asking me questions. When I told him what I saw, he did not say I was imagining it. He stood there with the engine roaring and the lights blazing, and he looked scared, yet relieved, like he thought he was about to lose another one. He looked out at the black water where I was pointing, and eventually he said, "How close did you get to going in?" I explained to him that I had not come close. I came off the rail quick, but I was shaking too hard to say much else. He nodded slowly, staring at the water. And he said something, and it was the only time I ever heard him admit that the thing was real. "I've lost 2 men to it, before your time. Good men. I've heard it sing every season of my life. I felt it in my head, trying to walk me to the edge, to the rail, like it had walked Sully and you. In 50 years, I never once saw it. Not all of it. Not like you just did." His expression changed. He looked sorry for me, guilty even, like this was his fault. "You shouldn't have been out here alone," he said. He had Tuck take me below, and we ran with every light on until morning. Then we pulled the hook and ran for Dutch, and the season was over. That's everything I saw, and everything I was told. And I've now told it straight through for the first time. And I'll admit, my hands aren't as steady right now as I'd like them to be. I'll explain the little that's left. I didn't go back. Cap settled with me on the dock, and it was a lot of money, a full share even though I was technically still a greenhorn, and he shook my hand hard, holding it a second, and telling me, "You're a good hand. You could do this, but you don't have to. And if I were you, I wouldn't." That was the kindest and the hardest thing anybody on that boat ever said to me. I flew home to Anacortes, paid off the guy I owed, and I bought a new truck. And I didn't fish again, not in the Bering Sea anyway. I work in Bellingham now, not in the water. There's something else I still have to say. What I know about the crew, and what happened after. They kept on doing their thing. Fishing, that is. And I know that Tuck died in 2016 of a heart attack, thankfully in his bed, not out there in the sea. Gil, I'm not sure. He'd be in his 80s if he was still alive, which I somehow doubt. I hope he is. I hope he's somewhere being loud and happy. Now, about the St. Jude itself. In 2011, the St. Jude went down in bad weather, west of the Pribilofs, not far from the slot. There were 5 aboard at the time, and the Coast Guard recovered 2 of them out of the water, alive and half frozen but breathing. They never found the other 3. Tuck was one of the ones they did find, but Cap was one of the 3 they never did. Old Half-Thor, who'd owned and run and slept aboard that boat for 30-odd years. The guy who made those rules to keep us alive. Well, Cap went down with the ship. According to what I read, they searched and searched, and they found only empty suits. They never found Cap, or the other 2 that went down with him. Just remember what Gil had told me about those suits. A man in a suit floats. That's the whole point. And you tell me why they keep finding empty suits, no people inside. What does that mean? Well, if I had to answer, it'd be a very dark answer. But here's my conclusion. I think Cap's face has joined the other faces now, and his face is one of the newer ones, near the front, waiting and beckoning the next new people to sink into the water. Thank goodness I'm in Arkansas. No seas near me. But I do drive over the Arkansas River from time to time, and I'll be darned if I don't do a double take at that water now, hoping I don't see any faces. Albeit redneck faces, but still faces that shouldn't be here. Good night. Thank you for listening to the Unexplained Encounters podcast. I've been your host, Darkness Prevails. Catch more scary story narrations from me on my other show, Tales from the Break Room, which you can find on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast app. If you're wondering about the EerieCast app, it's still in the works, and we're very, very close to releasing it. So stay tuned for an announcement. The app will be the place where you can listen to all EerieCast shows, get samples of bonus content that's members only, or become a member yourself, unlocking tons of hours of extra narrations, ad-free, and you can download for offline listening. It's all coming soon on the EerieCast app for Apple and Android devices. So again, stay tuned for the announcement. Thank you all for your support and for sticking around all these years. Here's to many, many more to come. Till next time, stay safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one. What do you know the state of Wisconsin for? Cheese? Beer? What about the strange tall man that lurks in the woods and takes the heads of lost men? Haven't heard of that one, have you? This week on Unexplained Encounters, a story submitted by Driftless Daughter details her grandfather's bizarre rituals on his Wisconsin farm, and what happens when those rituals are not adhered to. This disturbing story is titled Second Cutting. Keep your head. In the summer of 2009, I was 16 years old. I got sent to live on my grandparents' dairy farm in southwestern Wisconsin. They had a small operation of 40 cows milked twice a day by 2 people in their 70s out in the driftless hills southwest of Oroka. It was in one of those dead-end valleys the locals call coulees. The glaciers that flatten the rest of the Midwest missed that corner of the state. So instead of flat cornfields, it's steep wooded ridges and deep narrow valleys, like somebody crumpled up all the land, but never smoothed it back out. The roads follow the creeks. Cell service didn't work out there at all, and when my mother dropped me off that June, I lost my phone signal 20 minutes before I lost her taillights. I just remember thinking my life was over. My parents had split up that spring. There was no affair, no screaming, just they quit being happy with each other. The divorce meant the house would get sold, and that meant for one summer there was nowhere for me to be, while my mother moved us into an apartment in Madison. Her solution was her parents' farm. She pitched it to me. "You'll have fresh air and time to think." But all I heard was exile. I cried the whole way down Highway 14, and my mother let me. She hugged me in the gravel driveway and told me she would call the landline every Sunday, and drove away. But, good news, it turned out to be the best summer of my life. It's also the reason I still sleep with something playing in my ears. Podcast, YouTube, you name it. But it's gotta be something. My grandparents were Earl and Dorothy. Grandpa Earl was 74 that summer, a chiseled old man. One of those old farmers who looked skinny until you watched him throw a hay bale one-handed, and he wore a seed cap so sweat-stained it had gone from red to a color I'm not sure I have a name for, but something between brown and reddish-yellow. He wasn't much of a talker, and I don't mean that in a cold way. He was simply never the type to waste words. Grandma Dorothy was the opposite, 71 and sharp as a tack, and she ran the house and the books and had opinions on every little thing, and those opinions she would share at volume. Her favorite topic was my grandfather, who she had been married to for 52 years, and she always referred to him as your grandfather, in a tone that could land anywhere between proud and straight fed up. There was Duke, their farm dog, some kind of shepherd-collie mix. He was 10 years old and gray around the muzzle, and the single most sensible creature on that property. The farm itself sat at the head of a dead-end valley. The gravel road followed the creek 2 miles past 3 other farms and ended at their place. Behind the house and barn, the valley kept going another half-mile, narrowing the whole way. And that backstretch was theirs too, a long triangle of pasture and hay ground running up to the wooded ridge at the end of the coulee. Everybody called it the Back 40, though Grandpa told me once it was actually 36 acres. The creek came down out of those woods, except by July it wasn't a creek anymore, but a dry, stony ditch cutting across the valley floor like a line somebody had drawn. That was called the Dry Run. The first 2 weeks, I was a mess. I sulked and wore earbuds at the dinner table until Grandma removed them from my ears with 2 fingers, like she was picking ticks off a dog. She set them by my plate without a word, which was somehow worse than her yelling at me. Grandpa didn't try to talk to me at all, but he did assume that I would be helping around the property. So, the second morning, he knocked on my door at 4:45 and said, through the door, "Cows don't milk themselves." That was the whole speech. I'm not sure why I got up. Honestly, I think I was too surprised to refuse him. I stumbled down to the barn in the still dark, in my mom's old boots, which were somehow still in the mudroom from 1985, and Grandpa handed me a bucket of warm water. He showed me how to wash a cow's udder before the milking unit goes on, and that was my job for days. Wash the next cow, move down the line. A milking barn at 5 in the morning in summer is one of the best places on this earth. It's warm, but not like a furnace, but a cozy warm created by 40 big animals putting off heat. And it smells like hay and molasses feed. I know that might sound bad to some, but it's not. It's super cozy. Every cow goes to her own stanchion. They know their spots better than kids in a classroom, and the milk pump runs its steady thumping pulse. Under all that, there's the radio. There was an old radio on a shelf up there, coated in 40 years of dust. There was an old radio on a shelf up there, coated in decades of dust and fly specks. It was tuned to an AM station out of La Crosse that played polka and farm reports. Saturday mornings it carried a call-in swap show where a man might spend 4 minutes describing a used hay rake. And it was always on. We'd finish milking and Grandpa would shut off the pump and the lights, but he always left the radio playing to an empty barn. All day, all night. I asked about it, still in my sarcastic phase. "Do the cows like polka?" He replied to me without even looking. "Barn's never quiet, that's all." His tone said, "Never ask again," so I didn't. Maybe it was just old person weirdness. By the end of June, something had shifted in me. I couldn't have told you when it happened. The chores did it. Every adult in my life had been telling me hard work would be good for me, and I'd wanted to die every time they said that. But there's a thing that happens when you do necessary work that a living animal depends on, twice a day, every day, where your brain starts to quiet down. You can't spiral about your parents' divorce while you're pushing feed up to 40 impatient cows. The farm don't care about your feelings, sweetheart. And that turned out to be exactly what my feelings needed. I learned the cows first. Holsteins mostly, plus a few Jerseys Grandma called "my little browns," and she spoiled them rotten. They all had names, often stereotypical names, but yeah, like Marigold. There always has to be a marigold in a cow herd. There was also Trouble, and she earned it. And Church, who once got loose on a Sunday and walked 1.5 miles down the valley. She was standing in the church lot when the 8 o'clock service let out. Cows seem to have personalities the same way people do. And by July, I knew all 40 by their udders alone, which is a skill I really never thought I'd have, and not something I would ever put on a resume. I learned the routine. We milked at 5 and ate breakfast after. Eggs from Grandma's own hens and bacon from a pig they bought off the neighbors. The Hilfigers, spelled the exact same as the clothing brand, but no relation. The middle of the day was field work. The big meal came at noon, and they call it dinner out here. Apparently that's a rural thing in these parts. Dinner at noon and supper at night. It took me half the summer to quit saying lunch. After evening milking and supper came the part I didn't expect to love, which was the hour when nothing happened. When Grandpa read the Farm Bureau paper in his chair, and Grandma worked on a crossword at the table, narrating her opinions about it. Duke would put his chin on my foot, and there was nothing to check and nowhere to be. After the first month, I stopped feeling that phantom buzz in my pocket and just, I don't know, existed. I've spent a lot of my adult life trying to get back to how those evenings felt, but I'm starting to believe it's something you only get out in those parts, with that kind of life. Now, my grandpa. He was the hardest of the two to figure out. He taught you things by handing them to you. He'd be fixing the sickle mower and just hold out a wrench, and that meant get in here and watch. And he would never say good job. You knew you'd done the calf feeding right because the next day it was simply yours to do. The first time he actually complimented me out loud was mid-July. I backed up the hay wagon into the shed on the first try, which steers backward from everything your brain believes, and he watched me do it, then said, "Well." Just, "Well." Grandma heard it and called over from her garden, "That's basically a standing ovation, honey. Don't let it go to your head now." Somewhere in the middle of all that, I fell in love with the whole place, with that whole way of living. It was the safest I'd ever felt anywhere. That ended up being the cruelest part, because there was something out there at the end of that valley. It didn't ruin one bad night for me. It creeped its way into all the good ones, too. I'll get there. The salt came next, after the radio. Every Saturday evening after milking, Grandpa poured a full unbroken line of salt across the big sliding barn door track and the walk door. There was also a line across the bottom of the porch steps at the house, where it most likely looked like stained concrete. He kept it in an old Folgers coffee can on a shelf in the milk house, and he poured it very carefully and slowly. I was a city kid, so I assumed it was for like snails or slugs or something. But it was not for that. Then there were the Sunday walks. After dinner every Sunday, rain or shine, Grandpa walked the fence line of the back 40. Now, farmers do check their fences. That's normal. But I didn't think this was just checking the fence. He barely looked at the wire. He would walk the line slowly with the coffee can in one hand, and at certain spots and posts, not every post, certain ones, he would stop and pour a little salt at the base, pressing it down with his boot heel. The posts he salted weren't special that I could see. Some were old gray split cedar standing in a line of newer steel ones. And at the top corner of the back 40, where the pasture met the woods at the very end of the valley, there was a stone. It was square cut, about knee height, leaning, and the marks on its top face were worn too smooth to read. Grandpa would put his hand flat on it for a second, like he was touching a door frame before walking through. Then he'd pour the rest of the can out around it in a circle, before walking back down. There was also the mowing. Hay gets cut more than once a summer. The first cutting comes in June, and the field grows back for a second cutting in July. In a good year, you can take a third cut in September. Everybody in that valley followed that rhythm. Grandpa did too, on every field, except one. The back 40 got its first cutting in June, and then he would never touch it again that year. By August, that field would be past your knees, thick and going to seed. Real money just standing there in the sun while Grandpa bought hay off Roy Hilfiger to make up the difference. Bought it. And when Roy delivered a load in early August, I would hear him say, grinning. And when Roy delivered a load in early August, I heard him say, with a grin, "You know, Earl, you got a whole field of this back there." And I heard my grandfather reply, "Yep." Roy quit grinning and looked off up the valley for a second. Then they started to talk about whatever. My grandparents had a rule that was never announced, but was enforced, that everybody be back inside by full dark. Sundown was fine, dusk chores are half of farming, but once that blue-black moment came when the yard light buzzed on, you were in the house. Grandpa was always the last one in. He'd stand on the porch a minute looking up the valley toward that back 40. Then he would come in and turn the porch light off. That was the day, over and done with. One July evening, I was out past the yard light catching fireflies in a jar. Nobody was watching. I thought I'd get away with it, but then I heard the screen door. Grandpa came to the edge of the light and said my name sternly. One time. Freaked me out enough that I walked back inside as fast as I could. Grandma thought every bit of it was ridiculous, and she let me know so. She mocked all of it, openly, cheerfully, for 52 years apparently. The salt especially. I was shelling peas with her on the porch one Saturday while Grandpa did his lines, and she nodded at him through the screen and said, "There he goes, seasoning the farm." She told me that when they married in 1957, his mother took her aside and told her the salting was the husband's job on this farm, and to not interfere. And Grandma said, and I quote, "I thought I'd married into people who worship the devil. Turns out they just worship sodium." But here's what took me years to understand about my grandmother. She mocked it, but she never stopped it. 52 years of jokes, and not once did she sweep a salt line away or serve supper late enough to keep him from his Sunday walk. She knew all of it and remembered all of it better than he did, because she talked about it. Everything I know about the lore of that valley I learned from a skeptic. She told me about Vernon Williams in the garden the first week of August, while we were picking beans. I'd finally worked up the nerve to ask why Grandpa wouldn't cut the back 40, and she laughed through her nose and said to me, "Because his father did, and his father didn't. And if you ask him, he'll tell you the ground's wet back there, which, it's not." Snap, snap, beans in the bucket. Then, in exactly the voice she used for telling me which neighbors watered down their cream 40 years ago, she said, "It got worse after Williams, of course. Everything got worse after Williams." "Who's Williams, Grandma?" "Vernon Williams. Farmed the next coulee over, the other side of that ridge." She pointed with a bean at the woods at the end of the valley. "Oh, this is what, 19 years back? 91, I think. He had a heifer get out in the fall, got up into the woods on the ridge. He went in after her toward evening. and never came back out. Now it is real steep in there, and they got a search up the next morning. The fire department and half the county walked lines through the trees. They found the old heifer first, standing down in a ravine and wouldn't move. They practically had to carry her back out. And they found Vernon too the third day. Sitting down, they said. Sitting against a tree with his hands in his lap like he was taking a rest. She stopped picking for a second, looked at the beans in her hand, and sighed, before saying, "And his head was gone." I remember how my eyes went wide then, and my pulse picked up a bit. How was his head gone? What happened to him? What do you mean? "Oh dear, it was gone," she said. "They never found his head. They looked, believe you me, they looked all full, because you can't have quite the right funeral without the, head. The coroner ruled it was an animal. Coyotes, a bear come down from somewhere. Something scavenged him maybe after he died of a heart attack. That was the thinking. That's likely just what it was too. But of course the men around here couldn't leave it at just that. Your grandfather's generation, the older ones that were still alive then, they all got very quiet and very busy that winter, and a lot of salt was sold at the co-op that year. I can tell you, and Dolores Hilfiger told me her Roy started leaving the radio on in their barn too, which he'd always teased Earl about before. Men. They think it's something in the woods. Something that's always been in the woods that the old-timers knew about and walks the lines. And I'll tell you what I told Dolores. A bear doesn't carry a man's head off like a lunch pail, and neither does some boogeyman in the woods. Only a man can do a thing like that to another man. If it was anything but a bad heart and bad luck, had to be a person. That's worse than any story, if you ask me. That's why nobody wants it to be that. Too scary, the idea of having a person around who might cut your head off. So instead, there's a boogeyman in the woods, and we have to have the salt. There. Now you know as much as anybody around here. My grandmother was no fool. She was the least stupid person in the valley, and her version made the most sense to me. It still mostly makes sense. A county full of Norwegian and German farmers would rather believe in a woods thing with rules you can follow than a random death nobody can do anything about. She'd built herself a sensible account of her husband, and she lived in it comfortably. She got to stay comfortable for 52 years, precisely because he kept doing the things she mocked. She could afford not to believe, so long as the salt kept flowing. I asked her what the old-timers called it, that thing out in the woods. She rolled her eyes so hard I could hear it, then said to me, "Oh, honey, they don't call it anything. That's how you know it's men that made it up. Women would have at least given it a name." Then she straightened up with her hand on her back and looked for a second at the end of the valley. It was the middle of a sunny afternoon. Then we carried the beans in. That's what I mean about receiving a warning from a skeptic. She told me it was nothing. Every part of her told me it was nothing, except when she herself checked, the way she eyed those mountains and those woods. August was a hot one. The creek had been down to nothing since July. Duke was the first one whose behavior actually started to scare me. Duke went everywhere on that farm all day, making rounds like he was the shift manager. But Duke would not cross the dry run. I'd noticed it vaguely all summer, the way he'd trail us on the Sunday walk as far as the crossing, then just sit in the grass, ears up, waiting until we came back. The first week of August, I decided to test him. I was 16 years old, and I had just heard that scary Williams story. So I walked across the dry run into the back pasture and called his name. "Duke! Come here, Duke!" Gotta be the best dog I ever knew. He minded you like a soldier. He walked to the very lip of that stony ditch and stopped like it was a wall of glass and started to whine. When I called again, sterner now, he did something I never saw before or after. He barked at me, twice, angrily, a tone I'd only ever heard him take against strange trucks. Then he walked 10 feet back toward the barn, sat down facing me, and waited for me to be sensible. I came back across, of course, and the moment I stepped over the dry run, he was all wags and apologies, pushing his head into my hands and glancing past me at the back 40 the whole time. I stood there scratching his ears with my heart going a little quick for no reason I could point to, and I remember actually saying it out loud to him, the stupidest sentence of my summer. I told him, "There's nothing back there, you big dummy." The cows agreed with the dog. You see, the back 40 was supposed to be grazing for the heifers, the young stock, but that August they wouldn't stay back there at all. Grandpa would move them across in the morning, and by afternoon they'd be bunched at the corner closest to the barn, and the grass would be there untouched. Yields were down in the milk barn too, which Grandpa blamed on the heat. It was hot, that's true, but I started noticing where the cows looked in the evening. Cows are always looking at something. They're prey animals, after all. They keep watch. These cows at dusk all faced the same way, up the valley. 40 heads pointed at nothing except for a field of hay going unused. But the first time I saw it was August, the night before my mom's Sunday call. I spent that whole call the next day not telling her. The first real secret I ever kept from my own mother. It was dusk, milking just done, and I'd been sent to bring in a garden hose from behind the machine shed. So I was standing at the corner of the shed with the coil on my shoulder, facing up the valley. The driftless does this thing at dusk where the ridges go black before the sky does, so the valley becomes a bowl of last light with dark rims, and the back 40 sat at the bottom of it. And along the top of the field where the fence ran against the woods, I was looking at the fence posts, a row of little dark verticals against the pale grass. Sort of just my mind going anywhere else, so I was staring at something yet nothing. But there was a post between the posts, I noticed. It wasn't dramatic, just a dark vertical in the fence line like the others, except the spacing wasn't right. It stood where no post should be, and it was too tall, taller than a fence post by a couple feet at least, and thinner. I stood there telling myself it was a post they never pulled, or a dead sapling. And then, at 400 yards or more, the top of it moved. A small, slow tilt, like a head turning. Every hair on my body stood up, because obviously fence posts don't do that, but also because it didn't move like wind had pushed it. It moved like it had noticed I'd stopped walking and wanted to look at me. The yard light buzzed on behind me. That's how close to full dark it was, and the screen door banged. Grandpa came out onto the porch like he did every night, and I heard his footsteps stop. I was expecting him to call my name, but he didn't. He came off the porch and crossed the yard to me directly and stood next to me, looking where I was looking. By then, it was gone. In the few seconds I'd glanced toward the porch, the fence line had gone back to its right number of posts. Grandpa looked up at the valley a long time, apparently at nothing, at grass, I guess, then took the hose off my shoulder and said to me, "Inside, now." He didn't seem frightened. I never once saw my grandfather scared. That helped me to stay together, more than anything else. But he wasn't surprised either, and that's what kept me awake that night. Whatever I had half seen at the top of that field, my grandfather had not been surprised by it. I slept with my window latched, in August, in a farmhouse with no air conditioning. Down across the yard all night, I could hear the barn radio playing polka to all those cows. And for the first time all summer, I understood there was more meaning to that radio than I initially thought. I tried again the next day, while we were fixing a water line, both of us on our knees in a trench. It turned into the longest conversation about it we ever had, which I think is only because his hands were so busy, and nobody was looking at him. I said to him, "Grandpa, what did I see last night?" He cleared his throat, but stayed silent for a while. I wasn't sure he was even going to answer, until eventually he said, "Fence line." I replied right away, "But I saw something there standing at the fence line." He was quiet again. He got the coupling seated, then he said, "It stands there sometimes, along about when the hay would come ripe." I went still, shocked. That was already more than I expected out of him. I made the mistake of flooding him with questions and he didn't answer one of them. He just let me run out. Then he said the thing I've remembered ever since. He said, "It was on this land before the farm was. My granddad's granddad cut hay for it before he cut any for himself, and we let the back field stand for it now. We keep to our side after dark, and it keeps to its side. That's all the understanding there is. It's not a thing you learn about. It's just a thing you put up with and respect." Respect. That was the word my grandfather picked. A man who barely talked, and he spoke of this thing like it was a neighbor. The worst neighbor in the world, I imagine. One you have to salt your doors against. But a neighbor all the same, with a boundary line and a deed older than the farm. Before we climbed out, I asked about the stone. He wiped his hands on his pants and said to me, "Survey marker. Government men set it when they cut the lines through here. Before statehood, even." He looked at me sideways and added, "First lines anybody ever cut through these hills. Crews dragging chains through the woods, marking corners. One of those crews came up this coulee." He sat up then, coughed a little bit, and cleared his throat once more. "Not all of them came back down." Then he picked up his shovel. That was the end of the talk. I went to the library in town, and I found one sentence. In an 1856 county history, in the middle of a paragraph praising the valley's timber, it said, "The first survey of this town was attended by difficulty, the chainman refusing to complete the eastern line, and the corner was set at a distance by compass sight. So they set the corner from far away, because the men paid to walk that line would not walk it, and that was the corner with the stone, the one I'd put my hand on." After that, I couldn't look at the place the same. Nothing on the farm was any different. The days stayed golden and the work stayed good. And if anything, I loved it there more, now that I knew what it was costing my grandfather to keep it that way. But I'd finally seen what the habits were for. The radio wasn't a habit. It was there so a human voice never stopped inside that barn. The salt lines got renewed every Saturday, because boots and weather slowly broke them down throughout the week, and I caught myself stepping over them carefully now, not scattering the grain anymore. In the evening, when Grandpa stood on the porch looking up to the valley, I understood he wasn't taking in the air. He was doing rounds. He had been doing rounds since before my mother was born, and nobody in 3 generations had thanked him, because when he did it right, nothing ever happened. Nothing to thank him for. Well, not apparently. I saw it twice more that month, at dusk both times, and far off. Once at the fence line again, standing in the gap between two of the old cedar posts, the salted ones, and I'd swear it stood exactly centered between them, like it had measured them itself. And another time, the time that still gets me, not at the fence at all, but partway down the field, in the standing hay. The hay was well past your knees by then, and I could see too much of it above the grass. I never saw it close. Thank God for that. It stood taller than any man, with a thin body, with gray skin, the same gray as those old cedar posts it stood among, and it never moved while I watched. I'm not sure why. What did it want to do? What was its goal, just standing there and waiting? It almost always stood exactly on its side of every line. But then, it began to come down to the dry run. The last week of August, small signs began to show up on our side of the valley. On a farm, you know your ground like you know your own kitchen, and you notice when something's been moved. It started with Duke. He stopped making his rounds, and he pulled all his little patrols in close. He spent his nights on the porch facing up the valley, and some mornings he was hoarse. He had been barking in the night, alone, at nothing we ever saw or heard, until his voice wore out. So Grandma started letting him sleep inside, which she had sworn for a decade she would never do. And she made a joke about going soft, but no one laughed. Duke slept on the kitchen floor with his body against the door. Then it was the heifers. One morning, 3 of them were out, through a fence in the night, and not the back fence, the near one. They'd broken out of the safe pasture toward the barn, and we found them at dawn pressed against the barn wall, under the eave like cattle huddled against a windbreak in a blizzard. Except the night had been dead calm. The wire was pushed over from the pasture side. They had apparently hit it running, and in a soft spot along the dry run, there was a mark. It wasn't any kind of footprint. It was a long, narrow pressure mark, deep at one end, like a heavy post had been set down there and leaned on, then picked up again. Grandpa stood over it, fixated on it. Then he hitched an old harrow to the tractor, which he pulled to smooth out dirt, and dragged that whole strip of ground flat. I know that he wasn't erasing it to just get rid of it, like it was nothing. He was removing it because Grandma walked that way to her raspberry patch. Then came the radio, and after that night I stopped sleeping right. It was around the end of August. My window faced the yard and the barn, and you could always hear the radio from my room, faint but there. A voice or an accordion under the crickets, and it was honestly a comfort, and it meant all was well. That night I woke around 2, and lay there, slowly understanding I was listening to the crickets and nothing else. No radio. I got up and looked out. The yard light was on and everything seemed normal. The barn was a big pale shape, and I stood with my forehead against the screen telling myself the station just went off the air, but also that old radios can die. Their tubes burn out. But then, even the crickets stopped. The whole valley suddenly, all at once, went quieter than I knew outdoors could ever get. And out of that quiet, the barn made a different sound. One long groan of wood under load. The sound a barn makes in a windstorm when it takes a gust broadside. One time, but there was no wind. I didn't wake anybody, and the best answer I can give you for why I didn't was that I was a kid, a scared one at that. I stood at the window until the crickets came back, and at some point after that, the radio faded back in mid-polka, which is not what a burned-out tube does. I got back in bed, laying there stiff as a board, until Grandpa's alarm at 4:45. At milking the next morning, I told him everything I'd heard. He didn't stop milking, but when it was done, he did something I'd never seen him do. He got the coffee can on a Thursday and re-poured every line. And that Sunday, he carried the can and a spade. And at the old cedar posts, he didn't just pour salt. He cut a little trench post to post and filled it, a buried line clear across each gap. I helped him, and we didn't talk much. The woods were maybe 80 yards off, full of August shade, and I've never in my life felt so watched. Duke sat at the far side of the dry room the whole time, watching us from as close as he dared to come. On the walk back down, Grandpa said something. He said, "Hay's overripe." And I looked at the back field. All that standing grass gone heavy-headed and started to fall over in patches. I said, "Is that bad?" He replied, "It's never stood this late. I mulled that over in my mind for years before I got it. Other summers, that field got used. By late August, there'd be trails pushed through the grass and pressed down places the size of a truck where the hay lay flat, like a deer bed but bigger. And by fall, the whole field looked grazed off, though nobody ever saw an animal in it, and nobody ever cut it. That was the deal. The field was the rent, and every year the rent got taken. That summer the field stood perfect. No trails, nothing pressed down, the whole crop standing there going to waste into September. Whatever it was no longer taking what was left out for it, and it had started coming down to look at us instead. Even at 16, I could tell what was happening. Everything my grandfather did was still holding, and that thing up the valley. It was testing the perimeter, sometimes getting through. There was a thunderstorm on the 3rd of September. That was my last week. School would start after Labor Day, and my mom was coming Saturday to get me. I was heartsick about leaving. I never would have believed in June that I would feel that way. The whole day felt like storm weather. It was hot, swampy, and green-skied. The radio would interrupt the music to talk about severe thunderstorm watches for Vernon and Crawford counties. At supper, the phone rang. Grandma's sister Helen over in Westby had fallen and was in the ER in Baroka with a hip that they thought was broken. Grandpa did not like leaving his farm. I watched him stand at the window looking up the valley at the storm light while Grandma got her purse. I heard him say, "I don't like it." And Grandma replied, "Earl, she's my sister." They figured they'd be back by 10. Milking was already done and the storm was supposed to pass south. I was a teenager, not a toddler, so they let me stay. Grandpa stood in the doorway with the truck keys. He told me to keep the doors locked and leave the porch light on, that Duke would stay inside. Then he gave me the same look he'd given me in the trench, and he said, "You don't go outside. Whatever you hear. If there's trouble, phone the Hilfigers." "Okay, Grandpa," I told him. The storm didn't pass south. It came up the valley around 9, and coulee storms are an event. The thunder gets caught between the ridges and rolls back and forth, like someone moving barrels around upstairs. And the rain hit the house sideways. Duke had himself pressed flat against the kitchen door, shaking like a leaf. At 9:20-something, the lights browned and came back, and then went out for good. The yard light died with them, causing the whole valley to just disappear into the void. Outages weren't rare. I knew the drill. So I got the flashlight from the mudroom and stood in the kitchen listening to the rain. It took me a full minute to hear what I wasn't hearing. The radio was off too. That very same moment I realized that, from across the yard through the rain, came a sound I knew with my whole body after a summer of milking. It dropped my stomach right through the floor. One of the cows was mooing, Screaming, really. And if you've been around cattle, you know that's different from regular mooing. This was distress, over and over from the barn. And I knew exactly which animal, because we had exactly one animal due. A first calf heifer Grandpa had put in the box stall that very evening, because he didn't like how she'd been acting. It was Marigold, one of the fourth or fifth ones named Marigold, Grandma's little brown with the white smudge on her forehead. That was the heifer I'd halter broke myself in July, who followed me around her pen like a big anxious dog. And she was calving 10 days early, in the dark now, in the middle of a storm. There I stood in that kitchen, behind a locked door I'd promised to keep locked, while an animal I loved was in trouble 60 feet away across open darkness. Somewhere out in that dark, at a distance I had no way to judge, was the neighbor. I called the Hilfigers first. The line was dead, unfortunately. The storm had taken it down, or it went out with the power. And Marigold out there kept on screaming, rawer this time, and I thought about what might happen to her and her calf with no one there. You could lose them both in an hour. I thought about telling my grandfather I just stood in his kitchen and listened. Is that what he would do? What he would be proud of? I didn't think so. So I grabbed a lantern from the mudroom, and I put on his barn coat because it was closest, and it smelled like Grandpa, like hay and machine oil, and I think that helped me to get across the yard as much as the lantern did. Anyway, Duke stood at the door with me. I asked him, "You coming?" That dog looked up at me, then at the door, and lay down on the floor with his ears flat. And he gave me a whine. That dog was scared, and I wasn't sure if it was the storm. It was then I was beginning to think that that yard was not empty. I went anyway. The whole plan was to get to the barn, bar the door behind me, and wait for headlights with Marigold. I opened the kitchen door and the rain was already slacking, and the thunder had rolled off down the valley, so the lightning came late and low behind the ridges. I put the flashlight beam on the barn door 60 feet away, and I didn't sweep it around the yard. I did not want to see who or what else was out there with me. I had only one goal, one destination, and that was all I needed to see. In my head, I thought, if I didn't see something, it couldn't see me, so I could just keep walking. So I kept the beam on the door and just walked. The crickets had stopped, so had the frogs down at the creek. And about halfway across from up the valley, from some distance the dark made impossible to judge, one strand of fence made the sound wires make when something presses it down to step over. That low singing twang, then the softer sound of it coming back up. God, I wanted to run then, but I kept myself from doing it. It wasn't because I kept my head. My legs had gone so weak that walking was the best they could do. That's how scared I was. I got to the barn door. I saw that the salt line in the track had washed to a sodium slush. I rolled the door back and got inside, rolling it shut behind me and dropping the bar. I stood in the dark of that barn, with those dozens of cows breathing around me. Every single one was on her feet. If you don't know, cows lie down at night. They stand up when something is wrong. There were 40 animals in there, standing in the dark without a sound, every head turned toward the far end of the barn, the end that faced up the valley. Marigold was down in the box stall in the light of my lantern, and the calf was coming. It was coming right, thankfully, 2 little hooves and a nose, a textbook birth. She just needed time and calmness, when neither of us currently had any. I got in there with her, and I got her head in my lap like I'd seen Grandpa do with a down cow. I talked to her, low and steady, half instructions I was remembering out loud, and half nonsense. At some point, I understood I wasn't only talking for her. The radio was dead, and my voice was the only human voice in the valley. So for both our sakes, I dared not stop. But it came to the barn while the calf was being born. Things were finally moving with Marigold when I heard, over her, the fence at the near pasture. That same twang and release, close now, followed by nothing for a while. But then there were footsteps. I know what I heard. The steps were slow and too evenly spaced, yet too far apart. Each one landed flat all at once, like somebody setting the end of a heavy post down in the wet gravel over and over. It went along the barn wall away from me, one slow, flat step at a time, and every cow in that barn swung her head to follow it, but not one of them made a sound. At the far end, it stopped, and it knocked. There were 3 slow knocks on the boards, way up high on the wall, higher than the hay-mow door, each one heavy, and it wasn't testing the wall. I think it was letting me know it was there. The whole barn frame carried it down to me through the beams. Marigold pushed, and I heard myself get louder, and what came out of me wasn't a prayer. I recited the milking order, all 40 cows, stanchion by stanchion, starting with church at the front of the barn and going stall by stall toward the back. My voice shook so hard the names came out in pieces, but they came out, and I kept them coming, because it was the one thing I knew by heart, start to finish. Calves come all in a rush at the end, so there she was, a wet heifer calf in the straw all of a sudden, and Marigold turned around and began to lick her baby. The calf sneezed and shook her little ears. The rest of the barn was quiet. I didn't even know when the footsteps and knocking stopped. I lay in the straw with my back against the boards and listened, and a ways off, headed up the valley, the fence sang once more, far away. Moments later, the crickets came back, just a few at first, and eventually all of them. About 20 minutes after that, light swung across the barn windows, headlights in the yard, and I heard the truck doors. I heard my grandfather shout my name. He sounded worried, the closest to scared I'd ever heard him, but not actually there. And I'm sure it's because he found a dead dark house and an unbarred kitchen door. When he got to the barn door and his flashlight found me, sitting in the straw in his coat with Marigold and a live calf, the relief and fear went across his face at the same time. He came in the stall and looked the calf over, then at Marigold. After that, he looked at me. Whatever he saw on my face, I think he knew then, as he asked only one question. "How close did it get?" "The wall," I told him. My grandfather sat down in the straw next to me, at 74 years old in his church pants, and he put his arm around me. He had never done that before. We sat there against the boards together while Grandma stood in the doorway holding Duke by the collar. Nobody said a word about the promise I'd broken, that night or ever. Grandpa stayed in the barn until morning. I was inside, watching him from the window when I could. Grandma would not let me stay out there, and after the power came back around midnight, the yard light came on. There was my grandpa, setting a kitchen chair inside the open barn door with the radio going louder than usual. He had the coffee can on the floor beside him, and he sat there till dawn. The next morning, over breakfast, he talked more than I've ever heard him talk before or since. He didn't have answers. Nobody in that valley had answers to this. just the stories that had been handed down to him. His granddad's granddad had made the arrangement his first summer on the claim, after a winter he wouldn't describe at his own kitchen table, and the survey stone was already old in that corner when he did it. There had been hay standing for it every fall since, and each son got told at 18, or whenever the farm passed. He'd seen it 4 times in his life, every time in a dry August, and his father had told him the dry years were when respect mattered most. Because, and this was when Grandpa word for word said, a dry year, everything comes down to the creek. Grandma sat through all of it with her coffee and for once did not mock and did not argue. At the end, she got up and squeezed my shoulder on her way to the sink. I heard her tell the window, "Well, I still say only a man could do what was done to Vernon Williams. But you'll notice I never once swept up your grandfather's salt." 2 days later, Grandpa hitched up the haybine, driving it across the dry run, and cut the back 40. September 5th, the second cutting, 2 months late. He cut it alone and he raked and baled it. But he didn't sell it, and he didn't feed it. Instead, he hauled every bale of that to the top corner and stacked them by that survey stone, a neat square stack like a little house, and left them there. It was the rent, but more like the rent laid out on the table and pushed towards the person it was meant for. When my mom's car came up the driveway that Saturday, the stack was the last thing I saw of the back 40, sitting there in the corner by the trees. The calf, by the way, we named her Storm, breaking about 4 generations of flower naming tradition. And Grandma allowed it because, she said, I'd earned 1 vote and I'd wasted it on that. I went back every summer through college, and it all held. Duke lived to be 14 and never crossed that dry run once. Grandpa kept his rituals, his respect, another 9 years. And when his hips finally couldn't walk the fence, I walked it, with him riding the 4-wheeler alongside me, telling me which posts. I learned to pour those salt lines slow and even, pressing the salt down with my heel. Grandpa died in 2018 in his own bed, and I think that's how every farmer hopes to go. I swear half the town came. Roy Hilfiger stood at the graveside and said to me quietly, "Your grandpa really took care of things up that valley." He then shook my hand. Grandma sold the cows that spring but kept the land, leasing the fields to a cash crop operation out of Richland Center. Nice enough folks with big equipment. I was there at her kitchen table the day the young manager stopped in to ask why the field at the head of the valley was excluded from the lease. "Prime ground," he said, "just sitting there." I watched my grandmother, 80 years old then, and a skeptic her whole life, look that man in the eye and say, "That field's wet." It's not wet. And when he pushed on it, just a little, she said, "It goes to my granddaughter and she's particular." That was the first I'd heard of it. She held my eyes across the table while she said it, and I understood I was being handed the coffee can. So, the farm will be mine outright when Grandma goes. She's 88 now, and mean as ever, God keep her. I live 2 hours away and I'm there most weekends. My husband thinks I'm sentimental about fence lines. My daughter thinks the Sunday walk with the salt can is a game her mother invented. And for now, that's fine. She's 7. There's time. The first cutting comes off that back field every June, and every June I stack it in the corner by a stone that men refused to walk to 180 years ago, and the second cutting stays standing. On August evenings, when the light goes silver and the ridges go black, I stand on that porch where my grandfather stood, and I look up the valley. Some years, some dry years, at the top of the field, the fence line has 1 post too many. I count them, and I give that extra one a nod. Then I go inside and turn on the radio. I like to think we have respect for one another, it and I. Well, that story wasn't all that scary. Sometimes your rural neighbors might be tall and thin and pale, and they just want to come over to see if your new calf is doing okay in the middle of a thunderstorm in the middle of the dark. Nothing crazy about that. And obviously he was anxious because he knocked 3 times and left. Can't blame the guy. That's what I'm gonna believe so that I can sleep tonight. Good night. Thank you all so much for tuning into this episode of Unexplained Encounters. I've been your host, Darkness Prevails. You can find me on X at Dark Prevails, and you can support the show by listening on Erie.fm. Sign up to be a premium member there, and unlock bonus stories, members-only shows, and premium-only audiobooks, and more. Till next time, everyone, stay safe out there, and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one. Make this the best Halloween ever by pre-ordering my 2 brand new books coming out soon. The first is Phantom Phenomena, a hand-picked collection of the all-time scariest stories I've ever received, accompanied by atmospheric illustrations and field notes. Then there's Appalachian Folklore, an extraordinary catalog of the chilling history, creepy folklore, and rich culture of the Appalachians. These release October 15th and 8th, respectively. Pre-order now on Amazon and Barnes & Noble. But hurry, because the first 100 pre-orders to verify via the link in the description or at eriecast.com/verify will receive an exclusive hoodie and hardcover copy of Lore, a folklore horror novel. When the biggest, toughest dog you've ever met starts running from something in the woods, you'd better start running too. Welcome back to Alone in the Woods. I'm Darkness Prevails, here to share with you scary eyewitness stories that happened in the great outdoors. Today's episode is a fun and terrifying one, featuring stories from all around the world, and a few of these tales are arguably some of the better ones I've heard in quite a while. Enjoy. If you have a scary story that happened outdoors, send it to me at eriecast.com/outdoor so I can read it on the show. If you like what you hear, help us reach more listeners by leaving us a rating or review on Spotify and Apple, and subscribe to Darkness Prevails on YouTube. Thank you. Now, throw a log on the fire, because the night is still young. What the Dog Saw. From Enda Spirit World. When I was a kid, I was an outdoorsman, as was my friend Larry, who lived nearby. We lived in a rural area with lots of opportunities for that sort of thing. Across the street from our homes was a huge tract of timber, where we would hunt whatever was in season, or go camping and fishing at other times. My friend and I knew of a small private lake too, about 15 acres in size, located 2 miles through the woods from our houses. One night, we set out to gig some frogs for frog legs. The neighbor's huge dog, Bozo, so named for his giant feet, came along with us. When we were about a mile into the woods, we had what I've always felt was a supernatural experience. Off to our right, about 30 feet away, there appeared a blue glowing orb, several feet in diameter. It seemed quite bright, but it didn't illuminate the surroundings like a normal light would. It reflected off nothing. The night was just as dark as it had been, deep in that black pine forest. We all stopped in our tracks, and Bozo gave a deep, rumbling growl. It was somewhat comforting to have Bozo there with us. He was mostly Great Dane and weighed more than 100 pounds. We walked on, maybe another 100 yards, and the light appeared again. This time, Bozo didn't make a sound. He bolted back for home in a blind panic. We could hear his big feet drumming against the ground and the crashing sounds as he slammed into trees and tore through brush, heedless of injury in his urgent quest to get anywhere else. As you can imagine, this did wonders for our confidence. We decided at once that we too should be elsewhere. Thus began our retreat, at a slower pace but with just as much desire to be out of those woods as Bozo had. There was something with us. We could hear it out there, keeping pace. We'd both brought flashlights to spot frogs, but the normally bright beams faded as soon as we turned them on, as if the batteries were already almost dead. We turned them off to save power, only switching them on when the accompanying footsteps, bipedal, got too close. Even with the weak light, we saw nothing in the gloom. I had a .22 pistol for snakes, and I gripped it with white knuckles. There was nothing to shoot. Twice as we walked, we heard the sound of someone running up behind us. We whirled around, switching on our lights, only to find empty darkness. My skin crawled constantly, and the hair on the back of my neck stood up. The feeling of being watched, of a malignant presence, was intense. The temptation to run blindly away as Bozo had done was always there, like a heartbeat. Once, something touched my shoulder, like a hand had been laid lightly on it, and I yelped. "Dang it," Larry said. "Something just pulled on my shirt." "We're going," I yelled into the darkness. "Leaving, just lay the heck off and we'll be gone." We stumbled on, knowing the road must be close by now. The pressure, the hatred, seemed to diminish with each step, and we began to see the glimmer of yard lights through the trees. We burst through the brush line and out into the open air of the roadway. Bozo came running to meet us, wagging his ridiculous tail like a whip. He'd waited for us there out in the open. He was worried about us, just not worried enough to stay out there in those haunted woods with us. I've always wondered what it was, what the dog saw. Almost tiger food. From J. Ion. My friend was born and raised in Bangladesh, specifically in the capital city of Dhaka. She left to study abroad when she finished high school, as did most of her extended family, with many of them choosing to settle permanently in the USA, UK, and UAE. Despite the separation, they remain in frequent contact with each other and made annual visits to their home country. In 2013, it just so happened that all the family members based abroad were visiting Dhaka at the same time, which never happened before. My friend's dad, who always played host to returning relatives, is somewhat of a leader of the clan. He decided that on this rare occasion of having the entire family back on home soil, they should all go on a holiday together to a local tourist attraction, specifically to the famous Sundarbans, a large national park that is home to the endangered Bengal tigers. He booked a resort village to accommodate 23 people for 5 days, within the vicinity of the Sundarban National Park, and had each day's itinerary planned with a local tour company. They all enjoyed the trip very much, especially because the peaceful and pristine forests of the Sundarbans proved to be a wonderful relief from the never-ending, overcrowded, polluted hustle and bustle of the capital city. On the 4th day, the more senior family members wanted to take another walk through the forest trails before they had to leave the following morning. By the time they made the request with the local tour company for 4 strangers to guide them on this walk, it was around the late afternoon on a Thursday. Because Bangladesh is an Islamic country, Friday is recognized the first day of the weekend, due to it being considered a sacred day. So many people will be winding down from Thursday evening onwards. What this meant was, instead of having at least 2 armed rangers guide the group, as per the recommendation by safety experts, the tour company managed to secure just 1 armed ranger who was willing to guide the walk on such short notice. My friend and her entire family were completely unaware of this safety recommendation then, so they happily got ready for the walk. By the time they were halfway through the forest walk, the sun was starting to set. The ranger had walked at the very front of the group with the more senior family members, while the younger ones were trailing behind, all of them distracted by their chatting amongst each other, and not realizing the distance they were creating from the safety of the ranger's guns. My friend felt her stomach rumble, very softly at first. Thinking it was slight hunger pangs or her weak constitution randomly acting up, she ignored it and kept walking while chatting. Just a minute later, she felt the stomach rumblings getting stronger, and something like vibrations from under the lungs. A few seconds afterwards, she felt the vibration spread to her neck and ears, an odd sensation which she had never experienced before. This was when she heard a very faint growl, like an angry animal snarling from within a closed crate. She looked around, but saw nothing unusual in the dim light of dusk. She asked her cousins if they heard something, to which they shook their heads and replied that they had not. But then they all heard it, a very distinct and guttural growl, almost like it was building itself into a roar. It came from somewhere in the undergrowth of the forest, causing the trees and forest floor to visibly tremble. They immediately sprinted as quickly as humanly possible towards the direction of the ranger. They'd been so slow in their walk, they didn't realize the ranger and the rest of the family were nearly 1 kilometer ahead of them. So the ranger and family couldn't hear nor see any of the commotion. The entire time that they were running for safety, my friend said she could hear the growls getting louder with each second. She was praying that they weren't being stalked, because no human could outrun a tiger, especially in the diminishing light of the evening, in the tiger's home turf no less. When they saw the ranger, they yelled at him to hold his gun up and aim behind them. The ranger looked confused and yelled back at them to stop fooling around. My friend's cousin screamed at the ranger, "There's a tiger following us! Shoot it! Now!" The ranger held his rifle up, aiming up at the sky, and fired a warning shot. Everyone quickly huddled behind the ranger, including my friend and her cousins, who sprinted right behind their elders. With his gaze still on the forest, he yelled at everyone to get to the end of the trail and get out of the forest. The ranger walked backwards slowly, rifle pointing at the forest until he got to a safe spot with everyone else. Once all of them were in the safety of a shelter, they told the ranger what happened. The ranger was stunned. This is when they learned that the tiger was in fact crouching only 10 meters from where they were standing, based on the strength of the growl and the vibrations. My friend, who had felt her body rumbling, actually was experiencing very low-frequency growls that are used as a sort of warning by tigers. The most surprising part of their encounter was this: any tiger within 10 meters of prey or predator would have pounced. At that short of a distance, a tiger would have chosen to eliminate a threat directly, then leave things to chance. They were miraculously fortunate to have encountered a rather patient tiger who didn't feel like leaving its hiding spot at that time. Needless to say, they were very relieved to leave the next morning. They breathed a collective sigh of relief when they were within sight of the city. As much as they enjoyed the majority of their family holiday, they were too shaken up by this close encounter. Funnily enough, just a few weeks before this family trip, the Life of Pi novel by Jan Martel was made into a movie. I joked that she could have befriended Richard Parker, but unfortunately she is not Pi in the open sea. She didn't find my joke amusing. The Stalker That Wouldn't Leave. From Miss 11. A few years ago in the south of England, I decided to go for a walk in one of the local forests with my friend Jay and his dog, who was a black cocker spaniel. These walks soon became a regular occurrence. We followed the main paths for about 45 minutes before deciding to venture deeper into the woodland. As we entered the area with tall, thin trees, an eerie feeling crept over us, as if we were being watched. A few minutes after, we came upon a fence topped with barbed wire, with a field on the other side and more woods continuing beyond it. We stopped at the fence, and Jay's dog froze, staring at something across the field. A couple of seconds after noticing the dog's strange behavior, we heard a laugh drifting on the wind. This wasn't a normal laugh. It was a wicked, eerie cackle. Jay and I turned to face each other in sync, both wearing the same confused expression. There was no one else around. We were deep in the forest, far from any other people. We looked back across the field and spotted a tall figure, about 6'8", with red hair, yellow overalls, and a pale face, staring right back at us. Jay's dog hadn't moved, still fixated on whatever it was. Without saying a word, Jay and I both reacted the same way. We took off running, with the dog following close behind. We ran for about 5 to 10 minutes, not stopping for anything, until we were finally out of breath. We slowed down just off the main path to catch our breaths and process what had just happened. As we sat there trying to calm down, we began to hear a rustling in the bushes, and that same eerie laugh again. Without hesitation, we decided to head back to our cars and just leave. A couple of weeks later, we went on another walk with Jay's dog, but this time we chose a different location, about 8 or 9 kilometers away from the last forest. It was a cold winter morning, and we met up around 7:45 a.m., bundled up in gloves, hats, and winter coats. This time we stuck to the main paths for the entire walk. We had completed about a third of the route when that uneasy feeling returned, like we were being followed. Both Jay and I caught flashes of red and yellow in the corners of our eyes, but we dismissed it as our minds playing tricks on us. That was until we were about 5 minutes away from the car park. We heard that eerie cackle again from our previous walk, and I thought I saw a white face peeking out from the trees. Ever since these two encounters, Jay and I have felt like we are constantly being watched or followed whenever we're out in the wilderness, no matter where we are. One night I went over to Jay's house for dinner, and I ended up staying the night. While helping him clean up after dinner, we saw a tall, shadowy figure in his backyard. The figure was human-shaped, but quite tall, and there were no neighboring yards close enough for it to have been anyone else. We immediately thought of that same thing we had seen before. We've tried researching local folklore or other sightings, but we haven't found anything. This remains an unsolved mystery. I've since moved away, but Jay still claims to have seen this figure and continues to feel watched. Whenever I return to visit, I get that same feeling too. I hope to God, whatever this creature is, it doesn't harm my friend or his dog whenever I'm not there. My first and hopefully last Wendigo encounter. From James 54:2. I'm 28 years old and living in Texas. This is my story. Back in 2019, there was a lot of talk about unknown creatures roaming the forests. Things like Bigfoot and even skinwalkers. But this story isn't about them. This tale is about probably one of the scariest things I've ever heard of. The Wendigo. A few months after one of my friends named Jacob mentioned the uproar, I went to see him. I'd been away, enlisted in the United States Marines, and I'd just been discharged. One of the first things I did was go to visit him. We were having a great time when he brought up the idea of going out to a little hangout spot his ex-girlfriend had taken him to when they wanted to get away for a few hours. I figured why not, so I grabbed my gun and we headed out to this extremely secluded area, where there was an old dock. The place looked abandoned, poorly maintained, with some boards nearly rotted through. About half an hour into our shenanigans, Jacob brought up the topic of the Wendigo. The name itself gave me a chill, even being a Marine. Curious, I asked him about it. He told me that if you went into the woods and said Wendigo 3 times, you would come across the scariest thing you'd ever see. Thinking he was bluffing, I told him to prove it. To this day, I wish I hadn't. We started to walk down a narrow path that led deep into the thick woods near the Alabama state line. We walked for maybe 20 minutes and decided we were finally in a good spot. It's worth noting that it had been raining heavily the past few days, so the ground was completely saturated. Jacob dared me to say it. I stood there in complete silence. The rest of the forest was eerily quiet, save for the tall pines swaying in the wind above our heads. Reluctantly, I started to say it. Wendigo. 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 Then, nothing happened. I let out a sigh of relief. In the 10 years Jacob and I had been friends, this was one of the few times I had proven him wrong. We started laughing and talking trash to each other when we suddenly heard a noise in the distance. Reflexes kicking in, I immediately snapped towards the sound, which was soon joined by others. I moved closer, and moments later, we saw a few coyotes running across the path about 30 feet in front of us. Another sigh of relief, but that relief didn't last long. I had a gut feeling that something was off. As we turned to leave the woods, a tall pine tree began to groan and creak as it fell down. Acting on pure instinct, I shoved Jacob forward, just as the tree came crashing down between us. Jacob screamed as the tree hit the ground, and I quickly jumped over it to get back to him. I could feel his heart pounding like a drum as I pulled him up to his feet. Still freaked out, he wasn't moving fast enough. I yelled at him. "Move, Jacob! Move now!" I spun him around, causing him to stumble and fall. I helped him back up, and we both started to sprint down the path, back the way we'd came. Neither of us dared to look back. As we ran, I suddenly heard a familiar voice behind me. "Jacob! Jacob, come quick!" It was the voice of Jacob's younger sister, Olivia. Jacob immediately tried to run past me, screaming, "Olivia!" I grabbed him. "Jacob, look at me. That is not her, do you hear me? That can't be her." Just then, another pine tree began to buckle. I tackled Jacob to the ground, and we narrowly avoided being crushed. I screamed at him again, "Go, get out of here, now!" As I shouted, I pulled a gun from my waistband and aimed it down the trail in the direction we'd come from. Jacob made it to the trailhead, turned back, and saw me still aiming my gun. "Bradley, get out of there! Hurry!" I turned and ran towards him. As I reached the clearing about 50 feet ahead, Jacob and I both saw it. The thing we had dared to summon. A Wendigo. It stood around 9 feet tall on 2 legs, with barely any meat on its bones. Its legs were unnaturally skinny, and its arms were even skinnier. Its skin was pale white, almost like that of a vampire. But what stood out the most were its eyes, a vibrant blue, almost like lightsaber blue, for those who have seen Star Wars. Overcome with fear, I raised my gun and fired at it. Jacob, not sticking around to see if I'd killed it, turned and ran for the car, and I followed close behind. That was my first experience with the so-called Wendigo, and I pray every night that I never encounter anything that terrifying again. In the Trees, from Gallon 24. I've always hated the walk back from my friend's house. It's about 1.5 miles of dark, empty road, with only 2 distant street lamps lighting the way. On either side, dense trees and thick forest loom like a wall of shadows. Every time I make that walk, I get this feeling in the pit of my stomach that something is watching me. I know it sounds stupid and cliché, but I simply can't shake it. My friends always offer to drive me home, but I usually decline. I guess I'm just stubborn like that. Anyway, this particular night, it was around 1 a.m. when I finally decided to head on home. We'd been playing video games and lost track of time. You know how it goes. I said my goodbyes and started the walk home. It was cold as heck that night, and everything was just still. The kind of quiet where you can hear your own heartbeat. Every step I took, the crunch of my boots on the gravel road seemed to echo way louder than normal. These street lamps were so far apart, casting these long stretches of darkness between them. I could feel my heart starting to race, even though I'd walked this road dozens of times before. It just felt different that night. I don't know how else to explain it. I was about halfway through the walk when I started to hear it. At first, it was so quiet, I thought I was imagining things. But the more I listened, the clearer it was. It was a soft, low noise, almost like a whisper or a hiss. You know how sometimes the wind through the trees can sound like voices? That's what I thought it was at first. But the more I listened, the more it sounded like, I'm not sure, like someone was trying to get my attention. I stopped walking and turned around, trying to see if I could spot anything in the tree line, but it was far too dark that night. My eyes couldn't make out much past the faint glow from the street lamp up ahead. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that it was all in my head, so I kept on walking, picking up the pace a little. Soon I heard it again. This time closer, way closer. It sounded like a low, raspy voice calling my name. Or at least it was trying to. I felt my chest tighten up, and I had to force myself not to stop walking. I didn't want to look again. I just wanted to get home. But then, I don't know why, but something made me look up. Something in the trees caught my eye, and that's when I saw him. Clinging to the top branches of this old, tall pine tree, maybe 50 feet up in the air, was a man. He was pale and skinny, almost skeletal. His skin had this grayish tint to it under the weak moonlight, and the way he was hanging there in the tree, it was like he was trying to hide. Or maybe he was trying to scare me, not sure which is worse. But I could definitely see his eyes. They were wide open and unblinking and locked right onto me. I'd never felt so unsafe before. I froze for a moment. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I was so sure I was hallucinating. But then I saw him move. It was slow at first, really deliberate. He shifted his weight, and I could see his fingers gripping the branch as he lowered his body slightly. It hit me then. This man was preparing to jump. I still couldn't move. I had to see what was about to happen. In one quick motion, I watched this man jump from the tree. The sound he made when he hit the ground I'll never forget. It was this heavy thud, way louder than you'd expect from someone who looked so frail. That sound was what finally snapped me out of my stupor. I ran so fast, legs pumping like pistons, and I didn't stop to look back even once. The road felt like it went on forever, but I kept on going. My breath was ragged, and for a while there, all I could hear in my ears was my own heartbeat. I just wanted to get home, get to safety. By the time I reached my front door, I was gasping for air. I slammed the door behind me so hard, my parents came running. They were startled, demanding to know what was going on. I tried to explain what I'd seen, but the words weren't coming out right. My parents could see how freaked out I was. They called the police right away. The 2 officers showed up pretty quick, and I was able to lead them back to the exact spot where I'd seen the man fall. The whole way there, I could still hear the sound of that thud in my mind, still feel his eyes on me. But when we got there was nothing. No sign of anyone. No footprints, no broken branches, no trace of the man I'd seen. The cops went ahead, searching the area thoroughly, but they found nothing out of place. They tried to reassure me, telling me what I was originally hoping it was, just my imagination, that I'd possibly mistaken a wild animal for a person in the dark. But I knew what I saw. They weren't about to convince me otherwise. Back at the house, my parents made me apologize. I did, and went to bed, partially embarrassed but mostly terrified. The next few weeks were rough. I felt creeped out on that road, and I stopped walking along it. If I had to go to my friends, they would either have to pick me up, or my parents would have to drop me off. Middle of the night, broad daylight, it doesn't matter. It's a pretty crazy story, and I've mostly gotten over it. But to this day, when I think about it, I get a chill down my spine. Who or what was that? I've always wondered if I watched an insane man kill himself in front of me, dying only after he dragged himself far enough away in the woods where the police wouldn't find him. Did it follow me? From Charlie Hall 765. Let me start by saying, my family has always had a knack for sensing spirits and other entities, especially my mother. She realized she had this ability when she was about 15, but that's a story for another time. This story begins back in the 90s when I was 11 years old. My mother, my older brother who was 13 at the time, and I lived way out in the boonies on a 5-acre plot of land in central Indiana. Our house sat about 50 yards back from the road, and behind it was a 2-story garage, a pond with a shed, and further back was an old wooden shack, with a patch of woods behind that to round out our property. When we first moved in, my mother told us to stay out of that shack. She said we'd been using it for excess trash or anything too big to put out by the road, and that raccoons and other animals would likely hang about there. So we didn't mess with it. We had plenty of land to roam and explore without needing to go near that shack. A little time passed after we moved in, and we started to experience typical ghostly encounters. Footsteps, gusts of wind where there shouldn't be, things like that. My mother told us not to worry, explaining that she believed it was just the ghost of a little girl who had drowned in that pond years back. She even gave her a name, Libby. Libby would do things that a typical little girl might do. Poke us, run around the corner and hide. It was all very playful, though it sometimes scared me because I was so young. But my mother always reassured me that everything was fine, and that Libby was harmless. I only had one encounter where I actually saw Libby, and to this day that memory is burned into my head. It was about a year after we moved in. My cousin, Tyler, was over, and we were in the game room, playing GameCube. The game room had a big glass window that looked out onto the backyard and the pond. As we played, I happened to glance out the window, and I saw what looked like a little girl, maybe around 5 years of age. She was standing under the pond light with her back to the house, just staring out at the water. She had jet black hair and was wearing a white dress with red polka dots and a little red bow in her hair. By this point, I'd experienced enough to know that if I looked away, there was a good chance she would disappear. So without taking my eyes off of her, I paused the game and told Tyler to get up and look. Now, Tyler didn't know anything about Libby, so when he saw the girl, he started to freak out, asking who she was and why she was out there in the middle of the night, where her parents were, and so on. All very reasonable questions. As he asked, the little girl slowly began to turn around to look at the house, and just as I was about to see her face, boom, she disappeared. That was enough for us that night. We turned off the game, lay down, and put on a funny movie to help us fall asleep. Fast forward about a year. We had grown so used to Libby that she didn't bother us anymore. One summer day, while my mom was at work, Tyler and I were outside fishing and catching garter snakes, just being adventurous. We decided that after living there so long without ever checking out the old shack, it was finally time for us to take a look. So we made the short hike back to the shack and went inside. There was some trash, but not as much as we expected. What we did find was an old wooden bed frame, a wooden dresser, and a little wooden baby crib that neither of us had ever seen before. They looked very old, almost handmade. Being the rambunctious teenage boys we were, we started to throw stuff around, breaking things and tearing it up. After we had our fun, we went back inside to get some drinks. When my mother came home from work, she barged through the front door, already yelling at us. She asked why we had been messing around in the shack and what we had done. At the time, we couldn't understand how she knew, since it had been hours ago, and she was in a different town. But she did know, and she was furious. We apologized and offered to clean it up, but she told us to leave it alone and stay in the house. After that day, we never heard or felt Libby again. I started to become really depressed and had trouble controlling my emotions. At first, I thought it was just puberty, but after a week or two, I began to feel like I was being watched, and not in a protective kind of way. Every day, the feeling got worse. One night, I was lying in bed, watching TV, about to fall asleep, when I got that feeling again, like I wasn't alone. I looked over at the sliding closet door in my room. The door was broken and wouldn't close all the way, and as I looked, I saw a pair of red eyes. Not glowing, but dark, barely visible red eyes, just staring at me. There was no figure, no body, just eyes. It terrified me to the point that I started sleeping in the living room and refused to go into my bedroom. About 6 months later, we moved out of that house. It took my mother years to finally tell me what had happened and how she knew about the shack. She told me that from the very first day we moved in, she had sensed something evil connected to that shack. That's why she warned us to stay away. And when I'd gone out, destroying the bed frame and crib, whatever evil was in there moved into my bedroom. We moved because she was afraid of what was happening to me because of it. Looking back, I realize what happened. Now I'm telling this story because ever since we lived in that house, I've developed my own ability to sense these things. Every house I've lived in since has had continuous, unexplained paranormal activity. Even the house I live in now, 20 years later, as a grown man with children of my own. Every apartment, every house, every building I've lived in has had these issues. It makes me wonder, has whatever I angered as a child been following me all these years, tormenting me at every stop? Was there ever really a Libby, or was it that thing posing as an innocent child to infiltrate our family and feed off our energy? I guess it's up to me to find out. Footsteps in the dark. From Tiny Goose. For context, it was my first trip to Scotland. My boyfriend and I decided to spend Christmas in New York, then fly across the pond to spend New Year's Eve in London. Since he has a bit of an obsession with Scotland, he insisted we spend a couple of days in Edinburgh and Glasgow. Word of advice: leave a little wiggle room in your plans. Due to a lack of planning, or maybe a few things going wrong, we ended up with no place to stay for a night in Edinburgh. We didn't think this would be a problem because we figured we could sleep at the bus station, as we were supposed to catch a bus to Glasgow first thing in the morning. After a couple of drinks and a friendly couple offering us a place to crash, which we politely declined, not wanting to impose, we headed to the bus station. We were hauling 2 very big and very heavy suitcases. When we got to the station, we stashed our bags in the pay-to-use lockers and sat down, waiting for the night to pass. To give you more context, we're from Argentina, where most public spaces stay open all night long, so it came as quite a shock when we were told we couldn't spend the night at the station, even though our bus was scheduled for 6:30 a.m. So yeah, next tip, do some contingency research. Next thing we knew, we were out on the streets of Edinburgh in the middle of January. After Googling a few hotels that might accommodate us and finding no luck, there was some sort of sporting event and all the hotels were booked, we ended up wandering the streets of the city, which I do highly recommend if you have a place to stay afterward. We found ourselves on a very quiet, almost eerie road on the side of Calton Hill. There was a row of fancy houses uphill, interrupted by a path leading further into a dark, secluded forest area. Our reason for being there: a small, reasonably priced hotel at the end of the road. We wanted to check to see if they had any vacancy. When we reached the hotel, we were greeted by a tiny maisonette, illuminated only by 2 old-fashioned lamps. We rang the bell and nothing happened. The sound of the bell interrupted the quiet, making us acutely aware of how lonely and isolated we were. We rang a second time, and we were about to ring a third when a withered, pale face appeared behind the window pane, staring back at us with a startled expression. The lady, who must have been around 80 years old, was wearing an old-fashioned pink gown. "Is this a hotel?" we asked. "Yes," she replied, surprised and almost offended by the question. Do you have any vacancies?" "No," she said, as if clutching her pearls, before promptly closing the small window and disappearing upstairs. And just like that, our hopes of sleeping indoors vanished. We headed back down the street, defeated. Let me set the scene. We were walking down this empty, eerie street illuminated only by moonlight. To our left, the row of houses stretched toward Calton Hill. To our right, the road sloped downwards into an abyss of darkness. When we reached the end of the street, a small path crossed in front of us, leading to an almost medieval-looking church that gave me the heebie-jeebies. My imagination ran wild. Don't all old churches have creepy burial grounds around them? I was snapped out of my thoughts when my boyfriend, the wildlife enthusiast, thought that he saw a fox running across the road, heading up Calton Hill. Naturally, he did what any sane person would do. He ran after it to get a better look. We have foxes in Argentina, so he really didn't need to be doing this. But there he went, and of course, I followed. I admit I did want to see the fox too. The fox disappeared into a fenced-off, heavily wooded area, and we were left standing at the base of the dark and beautiful monstrosity that is Calton Hill at 3 a.m. The sight was breathtaking, and we even considered going up the hill to cross the town. Then we realized something strange. The wind had died down. No leaves rustling, no animals burrowing, no owls hooting, and certainly no fox. The silence was deafening, and the stillness made our skin crawl. How could it be this quiet? We were only a few hundred meters from the main road. For a split second, my heart skipped a beat, and the most horrendous thought crossed my mind. What if we were led here? I quickly brushed the thought aside, but the idea lingered. We were sitting ducks. We could easily be hunted, and no one would hear us scream. Another thought crossed my mind. My mom waving goodbye at the airport, saying, "Please be safe, please don't do anything stupid." Oh God, what would she think if they found my body out here? I turned to my boyfriend and asked, "Honey, are there Wendigos in Scotland?" He looked at me, confused by the sudden question. "No, those are in North America, if they even exist." He paused. "But I think they have kelpies." "What are those?" I asked. "They're said to be water horses that can shapeshift into human form to seduce you and lure you into bodies of water. Then they drown you and take you away. But I would hazard a guess we're safe here. There's no water around," he joked. The joke didn't comfort me at all. My train of thought was interrupted by the only sound we'd heard for a while. A deep, loud noise in the quiet night. No, not just the night. It came from the exact spot where the last slivers of moonlight met the dark tree line, less than 2 meters away from us. Rhythmic thuds, loud, heavy thuds. 3 of them, as if made by human footsteps wearing heavy metal-clad shoes. But the most terrifying part wasn't the sound. It was that the noise stopped. Someone or something was lurking in the dark just meters away from us, listening and watching, knowing we were alone and vulnerable. Whoever or whatever it was had waited until we were close, took 3 steps, and didn't move again. For a few seconds, we froze. This was the kind of situation my mother had warned me about. My boyfriend looked at me with terror in his eyes and whispered, "Let's get out of here now." We ran. We ran like heck, all the way to Waverly Bridge, where we finally found a foul-smelling hostel to crash in. To this day, I still think about that night. What was it? Was it the fox shape-shifting into something larger and more menacing? Was it a drunk man trying to scare us, or maybe even hurt us? We may never know. But let me tell you this. Plan your trips in advance. And when your gut tells you to run, you'd better listen. The Thing in My Grandparents' Cottage. From Marvin Martin. This event took place in one of the villages up north on the Egyptian north coast, which, if you don't know, is a very popular summer destination. I was 16 when this happened. Every summer break since I was 5 years old, I would spend 3 months at my grandparents' house. So I was practically raised there, and it felt like home. The layout of the cottage was simple You walked in, and to the left was the living room, with a wide window backed by shutters overlooking the street. In front of you was the dining room table, and to the right was a hallway with 3 bedrooms. My grandparents' room was first, followed by a second big bedroom, and at the end was my small single bedroom. Finally, at the very end of the hallway was the kitchen and back door. I had just finished the school semester, and like a typical teenager going through a rebellious phase, I wasn't thrilled about spending the summer with my grandparents. But tradition always won out, so I had to go. That didn't mean I wasn't going to stay out late with the friends I'd made over the years. My grandparents were strict about curfews, and I had to be back by 11 p.m., which I did. By that time, though, they were already asleep. That night, I came back and grabbed a snack from the fridge. I sat in the living room with the TV on mute, and after a while, I began to feel really sleepy. Knowing they would wake me up at 6 a.m. anyway, I decided it was time for bed, especially since I actually enjoyed my grandpa's breakfasts. I fell asleep in my humid bedroom without a second thought, but suddenly around 4 a.m., I woke up, drenched in sweat and feeling incredibly thirsty. Since my room was right next to the kitchen, I figured I'd grab some cold water to cool off and help me go back to sleep. I quietly opened the fridge in the dark, trying not to wake up anyone. As I took a big gulp, I turned around, closing the bottle. That's when I froze. Right in front of me, only inches from my face, was a large black mass. I stood still, my heart racing, every hair on my body stood on end, and I couldn't move. For a moment I thought I'd gone blind, because this thing was close to my face. But I could still see through it. I could make out the streetlights through the shutters in the living room window. I tried to scream, but it was as if I was on mute. Panic surged through me, but I remained paralyzed. The thing didn't say a word or make a move. Suddenly I dropped the bottle, and just like that, its hold on me loosened. I bolted into my room, sat on my bed, and stared at the doorway where the thing had been. It didn't follow me, didn't cross the threshold. I stayed like that until somehow I fell asleep and woke up at 10 a.m. To my surprise, my grandparents had slept in, and I actually had to wake them up, which worried me a bit. On my way to their room, I saw the bottle still on the floor, proving to me this wasn't just a nightmare. Later in the afternoon, I called my dad and insisted that he find a way to bring me back to the city. I couldn't stay at this cottage anymore. I left that day at around 6 p.m. and never told anyone what happened. I kept it to myself. That figure still haunts my nightmares. In those dreams, it stands inches from my face, paralyzing me, leaving me waking up in a cold sweat and gasping for air. Right before Christmas that same year, my grandpa went out to the cottage by himself, as he always did, to seal the place off for winter. He wanted to make sure nothing was damaged while the home was abandoned until next summer. But my grandpa never came back. They found him lying in the exact spot where I'd encountered that shadow. Ever since then, no one else has set foot inside that cottage. This was 18 years ago. I've spent a lot of time investigating what happened. I've asked many of the Bedouin natives in the area about these kinds of entities, but no one seems to have a clue what it was. They say some cottages out there were built where they weren't supposed to be, but beyond that, there are no answers. Why the deer? From Please Stay. This story happened when I was 6 years old. I lived in a small town in southern Mississippi. and at the time, we lived on 246 acres of forest. In Mississippi, deer season is a big deal, and hunting is quite popular. That year, my dad was hunting from a tree stand at the edge of our property. As usual, being the curious one, I was up in the tree stand with him, reading some book about animals. Suddenly, a gunshot rang out. I looked up at my dad. He smiled and said, "I just got a buck." Evidently, a deer had walked out, and I didn't see it because I was too engrossed in my book. A few minutes later, we climbed down from the stand and found blood in the grass, leading towards the trees. As it was getting dark, we decided to go back home to grab flashlights before heading back into the woods to track the deer. As we walked, we came to a thick patch of woods and had to army crawl under some branches. My dad decided to go one way, and I went the other. I was about 50 yards away from him when I found a piece of a shoulder bone covered in blood at the base of a tree. I thought this was strange, as deer don't usually lose bones when you shoot them. While I was examining this bone, I suddenly heard the snap of a twig. I searched with my flashlight in the direction of the sound. What I saw will forever be burned into my memory. Standing there was an 11-foot tall, gray, human-shaped thing. It was dragging the lifeless body of the deer behind it. The creature didn't seem to notice me, and I didn't get a good look at its head. But I was terrified. I closed my eyes and began to cry. When I opened them, that thing was gone, leaving only a trail of blood leading deeper into the forest. About an hour later, my dad found me, still crying at the base of a tree. We never found that deer. That night, my dad took me home. I was silent the whole way, clinging to him on the four-wheeler, scared that whatever I had seen might come back for us. After doing some of my own research, I still have no idea what it was. But I believe it killed the deer, not the bullet. Since then, I've continued to hunt and fish, but I've developed a healthy respect for the woods, knowing that some things are better left alone. The creature I saw resembled a cryptid known as the country road creature, but I'm not entirely sure. If you have any ideas about what this might have been, I'd love to hear them. I plan to share more stories in the future about my encounters with cryptids. I went back to that spot a few days ago, hoping to re-spark some old memories. I found some weird claw marks in the tree, so maybe whatever I saw that night is still out there. But I don't plan on finding out if it still roams those woods. Ever since that night, fewer and fewer deer have been coming by our house. I'm not sure if it's connected, but I have a feeling it might be. I'll keep you updated if anything else happens. Skinwalker Encounters from Boomhauer 22. To start this story, it involves multiple encounters. The first one happened when I was about 15 or 16 years old. I was with my cousin. We'll call him L for the story. It took place at my mom's house, out in the middle of nowhere, Illinois. We did have a few neighbors, along with my grandma and grandpa living next door, but they were about 300 yards away. One night at the beginning of winter, Elle was staying over with me. After a fun and tiring day, around midnight, we decided to go outside for a walk. We stepped out the door and sat down on the porch for a minute to put our shoes on. Once we got them on, we started walking down the driveway. We had taken about 10 steps when Elle and I both looked towards my grandparents' house, seeing a figure run underneath the only streetlight. At first, we thought it was my grandma's dog, as that's what it looked like. But when it reached the road, it stood up on 2 legs and ran into the cornfield across the road. We turned to each other, and I was the first to speak. "Did you see that? What the heck was it? I thought it was my grandma's dog, but it looked like it was standing on 2 legs." "That's what I thought too," Elle replied. Realizing that whatever we had seen was not anything we could explain, we both bolted back into the house, nearly crashing into the door at the same time. Once inside, we locked every window and door in the house. There were a lot of windows, and then hid in my room for the rest of the night, with no further trouble. The next encounter happened a few years later, with my other cousin we'll call Dee. It was during deer season. Dee and I were hunting together as we usually did every year. We were sitting quietly, talking about who knows what, when a few deer came up. A couple of does and some small bucks, nothing big enough to shoot. While we watched them, suddenly a tall, skinny, rotting-looking figure appeared. It jumped onto one of the small bucks and took it down in moments, tearing it apart. We watched disturbed as the creature picked up the remains and carried them off. As it left, it made the most terrifying scream we'd ever heard. Once it was out of sight, Dee was the first to speak. "Was that what I think it was?" "Yes," I replied. "Yes, it was." At that time, we both knew about skinwalkers, but didn't fully believe in them. But after that day, we were quickly believers. The next story involves Dee again, and another cousin named Elle. Not the same Elle from the first story, though. This encounter took place in the woods around where we all lived. We set off to go coon hunting one night, leaving around 9:30 p.m. We arrived in the woods around 9:40. We brought 2 dogs with us and let them loose. After that, we stood around talking and playing on our phones. Suddenly, the dogs started to go haywire, which was unusual for them. Dee, Elle, and I grabbed our flashlights and set off into the woods. I had my .22, and Dee had his own. For those who don't know, the .22 is the best weapon for shooting raccoons out of trees. At that moment, I wished one of us had brought a bigger gun. As we ventured deeper into the woods, we started to hear a moaning sound, like someone being attacked. We all exchanged nervous glances. We knew no one else was supposed to be out here. Realizing we weren't alone, we sprinted towards the dogs, trying to figure out what was going on. As we got closer, we heard a long, high-pitched scream that stopped us all in our tracks. Elle eventually said, "That didn't sound human. What was it?" Dee and I looked at each other and replied, "Skinwalker," as the 2 of us had both heard the same scream a few years prior. Since the dogs belonged to Dee, he wanted to go after them, to try to save them if he could. Elle and I refused to let him go alone, so we all headed in together, lights on and guns ready. When we got to the clearing, we saw a tall, skinny, ragged, pale creature swiping at the dogs. The dogs managed to dodge each swipe, just in the nick of time. Dee and I aimed and started to shoot. My .22 was automatic, and Dee's was a single-shot rifle. I fired more shots, but my automatic only held 10 bullets, and I was quickly out of ammo. As soon as I ran out, the thing turned towards us. I swear we heard it say, "You all better run." Those words were all it took. We turned and ran at record speed through the woods. At some point, Dee tripped, and Elle and I stopped to help him up. The moment we turned around, we saw the figure of that thing running towards us, faster than we thought was possible. It moved in this weird, glitchy way, like a video game character lagging around. We booked it out of that forest, barely making it out alive. Somehow the dogs were right behind us. Once we were out in the clearing, we turned around and saw the tall creature standing at the edge of the woods, staring at us. We stood there, frozen, for what felt like several minutes. Then it turned and let out the same blood-curdling scream we'd heard earlier. We wasted no time loading the dogs into the truck and speeding away. None of us said a word the entire ride home. We were too out of breath, too shaken up. Our minds raced, trying to grasp how we all made it out alive, and how the dogs had too. None of us even had a scratch, but we all knew that we shouldn't have made it out. Thanks for stopping by our little campsite here at Outdoor Terrors. To hear your story on the show, send it to us at darkstories.org. For more scary stories from me, catch me on my other podcasts, Unexplained Encounters and Tales from the Break Room, on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast app. Or go to eeriecast.com for those and even more terrifying podcasts. Follow me on X or Twitter at Dark Prevails, and if you don't mind, leave a rating for Outdoor Terrors on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Till next time, I'll see you soon when the campfire blazes once again.